Good morning and welcome to our first meeting of 2026 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. And can I begin by wishing everyone a happy new year. I believe that we're still in time to be doing such things. This morning we are starting our evidence sessions on the draft climate change plan that has been published by the Scottish Government. And before I begin with that, I would just like to note that we will have Kevin Stewart and Michelle Thompson from the committee appearing online, along with Richard Woolley. And we are joined this morning by a panel of witnesses who comprise Professor Paul Delue, Director of Robert Gordon Energy Transition Institute, Stacey Dingwall, Head of Policy and External Affairs Scotland for the Federation of Small Business, David Thompson, Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation Scotland, Professor Karen Turner, Director of the Centre of Energy Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and Richard Woolley, Head of Energy and Climate Change from the Chemical Industries Association. And I should note also that we have Karen Turner also appearing online. I would ask, given the number of witnesses we have on the panel, if colleagues could direct questions in the first instance to particular members of the panel. But if other members of the panel would like to come in, please try and catch our eye or indicate online. And I'd like to begin by opening up by looking at the plan as a whole. And when I think about the debate that surrounded the previous climate change plan, there was considerable criticism that it was heavy on high-level targets and light on kind of detailed implementation. And that kind of risked, I think, a lack of clarity about how things were meant to proceed. And indeed, when you look at our carbon reduction from industry, since 1990, we've seen a 57% reduction, but that's not been driven by carbon initiatives. It's been driven by deindustrialisation. Does the panel think that this draft plan is a step forward in providing that detail, or are we risking further deindustrialisation in Scotland? And I was wondering if I could bring in Professor Paul Delue to open up and provide observations, given kind of your broad expertise.
Convener, I'm delighted to do so, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. First of all, can I just welcome the kind of enormous work done by whoever put us together. I mean, there's a lot of pages from some very good quality material, and I'm very impressed with what has been done. Can I make three observations, maybe to get us started? The first thing, when I read it, and I reread the kind of summary version a couple of times, we talk about a climate change plan. But actually, the more I read it, I think it's more an emissions reduction framework. Because actually there's a lot of elements in there which is not covered, which is particularly around resilience, adaptation and other elements which is not really kind of covered. So I think the first thing is around pick the right language is for me what struck me really. As I said, we all want to get to net zero. It's a matter of how we're going to get there. The other one what I picked up is there's a lot of detail in there, but it's not really clear in my mind who pays for what, who gets what benefit, who's going to do what, how is it all going to play out. And that's really important, and particularly as we look to the lens of business and industry, that we're really clear what do we ask companies, organizations, other elements to do, because one thing is a plan, the other thing is really deliver it. And the third observation I have, and I'm going to keep it really simple, Convener, if that's all right, I'm very happy to zoom in, is to really understand the cumulative impact of all of this on businesses, industry and consumers, because actually there's an awful lot going to happen, awful lot to be done. It's not really clear to me of how that will actually show up when you're sitting in a business. I spent all my life in industry before I went to university land. It is really kind of hard to say how this is going to play out, because you can do all this stuff, but you can't do it all at the same time. So it is really around how we prioritize, how do we make it happen, and support that by multi-year funding. I know the budget conversation is going to happen, but the budget conversations in Parliament tend to be one-year elements. This is a multi-year funding plan, but needs to be underpinned and needs to be really prioritized. So I think these three things, maybe to get us started, really welcome the kind of enormous amount of work done, the power of sits behind there, but some fundamental questions: how is it going to show up for business and industry, and how is it going to show up from a cumulative impact?
Well, thank you for that. And I think that question about actually what does this look like for business injuries is the very specific lens with which we are hoping to look at. And likewise, I know colleagues will wish to follow up on the investment and financing points. I was just wondering if I could also bring in Professor Karen Turner on the same point. Have we kind of drilled down into sufficient detail? Is this a plan, or is it still a set of ambitions regarding emissions reduction?
Well, I think it's probably, I mean, I would agree with Paul. I think it's moving towards having a plan, but I think I share the same concern really about how the costs are going to land, because who pays isn't just about the direct question of what's the financing, what's the approach, because obviously things knock on and a lot of analysis will show that, households ultimately pay because they either pay through taxes or they pay for the prices through the prices of goods and services. But I think when you're operating it at the Scottish level, especially when we're talking about, firm competitiveness and things like that, the real challenge that we've got is, whether or not we end up paying through jobs. If firms in Scotland lose competitiveness and jobs as well as emissions are kind of offshored. So I think that there is a challenge here that I think one of my concerns in reading the plan was in terms of certainly the upfront costs. I think it feels as if that's glided over a little bit. And again, a lot of the financing there, there's devolved versus reserved issues and things like that. But I think we still need to bottom that out. I think also in terms of the timing, there are issues. Obviously we've got the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of concern about that running down. I think one of the wider concerns is, whether or not we're actually able to soak up a lot of the jobs, transfer workforces across. But, there are issues that we might have some congestion in the near term if we're trying to do a lot, which could push up the costs of the transition, because it isn't just an absolute pound amount of what's got to be done. In terms of how do we pay for things, what's the wider economic reaction to that could cost jobs in effect, the overall kind of, pound bill, if you want to put that language on. So I think there really are questions in terms of the how, which is really what you need to be getting to with a plan.
And do you feel there's sufficient additional clarity on the how in what has been published?
Not yet, no.
So moving to sort of the witnesses that we have from industry, I wondered if I could ask a couple of more detailed questions, specifically around the role that hydrocarbons play in our industrial processes. When I've done a number of industrial visits, it's always struck me how reliant we are on gas to heat things, whether that's in kilns for making cement and concrete, or making glass bottles for our whisky industry, or indeed heating stills. I'm just plucking one industry in particular that we are very reliant on gas. Yet electrification, when you look at the documents, electrification is mentioned, but in the detailed annex, which is where the detail is meant to be, there is simply 2 paragraphs on electrification. And it's less than a third of a page. I just wonder if the panel feel that there is sufficient focus on actually how do we replace gas as a heating source for industry to and there's a broad range of things, as I mentioned, from concrete, through to steel, through to whisky. And I wondered if I might begin with David Thompson, given that whisky is Scotland's biggest non-energy export.
Yes, and it's not just whisky. Across the whole of the food sector, convener, there are significant use of gas to heat, to bake, to distill and to brew. And actually, it's that element within the manufacturing part of the food and drink industry, the transition and decarbonisation of heat, that is the biggest factor for individual manufacturers in their own site. And at the moment, the cost of electricity is the major disincentive. So from a firm's perspective, to change now from gas to electricity is not financially viable because of the high cost of electricity, and that's a significant issue. The industry knows that decarbonisation of heat and whatever solution for heat, whether that's electrification or hydrogen, is the next step for them. But these are big long-term investments for businesses, whether they're small, medium-sized or large. And so at the moment, the electricity cost is such that it's providing a major disincentive to companies moving forward.
I don't know who in the panel might be best placed to this, because the cost is one element, but there's also just the nature of the heat. I mean, there's a sort of ceiling on actually how hot electrical sources can actually heat things, which may suffice for some processes such as distillation, but certainly wouldn't for other processes such as cement and concrete manufacture or other very high heat applications. I know there's maybe not necessarily a specific industry representative, but I don't know if any of the panellists have any insight on that. I mean, do we need actually more focused research and development on actually how we replace gas as a high heat energy source?
To something as energy is my space. So there are certain processes, and particularly again, you get to steel particular treatments where you need really high temperatures, arc furnaces, elements like that. The vast majority, if we want to decarbonize, low-cost electricity is the big lever. The moment government makes low-cost electricity available, as David correctly pointed out, market forces will actually drive most of the other elements. So if you want to simplify the plan, you can say is actually having access to low-cost electricity will sort out all the industrial and business processes. So that would go a long way. Other countries have done this, right? This is not unique in the world. Other countries have been quite successful driving low-cost electricity, and their economies have actually quite benefited from it. So I think there's a huge opportunity and a huge prize for Scotland by actually driving the cost of electricity down, helping small businesses, helping the food and drink industry and others. There will be elements we cannot do that for. These industries might need to look at alternative options, and it could well be a combination of hydrogen or other elements where there will be some mechanism we need to put in place to make it successful.
So I believe Lorna Slater was wanting to ask a supplementary.
I think you've raised a really good point, both of you, about the importance of driving down electricity costs. I don't know if do you have a short action list of what actions the government needs to take to do that? I assume one of the actions would be unlinking the artificial link between electricity costs and gas costs that we have in the UK. What else do we need to do? Because I agree with you that that's a key driver.
Yes, I mean decoupling is one of the ways to be able to do that. If that's not possible, and we understand why the policy reasons are there for it to be in place, then the kind of things that you could do is provide incentivisation for decarbonisation projects, maybe a 10-year term. To deal with the increased costs and some kind of support in that kind of way, which would kind of moderate the costs for the business over a longer term period.
So specific subsidy as opposed to policy
potential
change?
Yes, yeah.
So the only policy change that you've identified then is the decoupling. There aren't any others that you'd consider?
Not. I mean, that's the biggest element, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know if you had the opportunity to look at your own domestic gas bill and electricity bill. It is quite interesting that if you look at the current, and again, everybody's bill is slightly different, but it's about 6 or 7 pence a kilowatt hour for gas. It's about 26 or 27 pence a kilowatt hour for electricity. We have a huge issue. It's 4.5 times more expensive to use electricity than to use gas. So there's a quite interesting element around this. If gas is the issue, why is electricity prices so high? Because actually gas is a lot cheaper. So there's a really interesting element that there's a lot loaded in by compliance cost, distribution cost, green charges, elements in there. So I think there's an element around redistributing and think about how we do the charges, but also we have a lot of capacity which is currently locked in, particularly because we can't use our wind turbines all the time. We have constraints in the system, which means that we pay money to actually not produce electricity. I think finding a mechanism of unlocking that capacity that already is built, sit there, so we don't pay it out in unnecessary charges will go a long way. Far more better distribution, far more strategic investment in the infrastructure, far more smarter consenting. There's a lot what can be done in the planning window set out in the climate change plan.
Thank you. Thank you.
I believe Stephen Kerr would also like to ask a supplementary.
Professor Delou, you said low-cost electricity, other countries have done this. Now, you mentioned a couple of mechanisms in your previous answer. Can you describe more about what these countries have done in order to get to low-cost electricity quickly?
Yeah, is it okay if I keep it short? Because I'm conscious there's a lot to go to. But well, some really interesting examples is what France has done and what probably Norway has done. So France, so we have a system in the UK where gas is the marginal cost of electricity. You know, again, the way the system works, we look at what's the last mechanism comes on. We're using gas generation, that then sets the electricity price for everything else. That is not a system in France. France, nuclear is the backup price, and because it comes in a far lower cost, the electricity prices are a lot lower. That's why we're importing elements. In Norway, it's hydro. There's different elements in there, and of course, the market will determine the prices. But there's other ways of doing it because we have the marginal cost linkages to gas. That's what actually has set about the price in recent years. So decoupling that will be quite critical. Now, that is something which is in the power of government, but it will require a reset of the system, and that is not a straightforward thing to do.
Indeed. And it's interesting, France has the lowest electricity costs in Europe, as I understand it. I believe that Karen Turner would like to come in, and I'm also going to come to Richard Woolley, and there's some specific questions I'd like to ask him. Professor Turner.
I think just add to one point to what Professor Delou has said in terms of our capacity. It's not just about firms using electricity in terms of things like green hydrogen production. You know, I think if we're doing work up in Shetland looking at the Sullom Voe terminal where they're looking at low carbon fuel production, where there could be a connection to the offshore wind farms in the NE1 sites. And, you know, one of the challenges in a lot of it is regulatory and, you know, and as Professor Delou said, a reset of the system is in terms of, you know, whether or not you can have, you know, whether it's referred to as a private line or something, is how we can use that excess capacity in other ways. So not just about firms using electricity for their heat, but in terms of things like the production of low carbon fuels, you know, green hydrogen derivatives and things like that, is a way to access electricity at a cost that, you know, because obviously we're talking about the cost of what we take off the network with the high price of electricity at the moment, but in terms of the cost of producing and getting to different production sites. So it's a wider question than just the use of electricity and lowering the market price of electricity. It's how we can actually use some of this excess capacity, avoiding curtailment costs, but also giving access for low carbon production processes.
And Richard Woolley, I know you were one to come in, but I'd like to ask you specifically, because as well as industrial heat, I feel that the other area that's of particular interest is actually use of hydrocarbons as a sort of a primary product for industrial production, whether that's pharmaceuticals, the chemicals industry more broadly, dyes, plastics, which are absolutely kind of key to the economy. And while there is sort of, I think, examination of the replacement of hydrocarbons in these processes, a lot of that is very much reliant on recycling. I just wondered what your thoughts and views were in terms of actually how clear this is as a plan to replace hydrocarbons in our wider supply chains.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and to talk to this point. Indeed, hydrocarbons have been a backbone of UK industry for a long time now. And the reason that the industrial clusters are where they are is because they're historically where the oil and gas would onshore. And then you'd have the chemical industry turning that into the basic raw materials that go into our manufacturing industries in general. So the chemical industry sits really at the heart of our manufacturing supply chain and is critical to a modern manufacturing economy. So thanks very much for kind of bringing that to the attention of the committee. In terms of its ongoing importance, obviously we need to get to a world that is net zero. And that requires the eventual circulation of the carbon that we've already extracted throughout the economy. So we've got carbon in an economic pool, we've got carbon in an atmospheric pool, we've got carbon in a biological pool, and we need to be pulling on all of those resources to start to displace the carbon that we have historically been pulling from fossil fuel resources. It's not going to happen straight away. And in fact, we're quite a long way from that position. And that's because if we're pulling carbon to use in product from sources other than fossil fuels, then we're having to do all of the work that geology has done in order to get to a raw material that's usable, and that's to create the kind of advanced materials, pharmaceuticals, chemicals that we use every day in our modern lives. So that is obviously a very energy intensive process. Planet Earth took millions of years, high pressure, high heat to get to that incredible material, crude oil that we've been using. And we're going to have to do the same thing. So we're going to have to reach high temperatures. We're going to have to reach high pressures. That's energy intensive. And we're going to have to do it with electricity. And so if I can pick up that point as well, sorry, I should say the industry is looking at three main sources for carbon in the future. That would be bio-based carbon, so any waste biomaterials, so from forestry, from farming, anything that can't otherwise be used, we can turn that into valuable product and add value to the economy. The other sources are recycling, as you correctly mentioned. So even the stuff that can't be mechanically recycled can be captured by our industry and chemically recycled into a tack oil, similar to crude oil, that can be used again for things like chemical production or even sustainable aviation fuel production. And the third source is captured carbon. So one of the side benefits of putting in this carbon capture infrastructure in the clusters, and obviously we're waiting for funding to come to the Scottish cluster, and we're hopeful that we're really hoping that will happen soon. But one of the side benefits of putting in this carbon capture infrastructure alongside hydrogen infrastructure is that we can take those captured carbon molecules and combine them with hydrogen to make useful hydrocarbon molecules that can be used to make the chemical products that we currently make with fossil fuels. But all of this stuff is energy intensive, and you're already at a position where the industry is uncompetitive because there are locations with cheaper energy costs and cheaper raw material costs. So we're already uncompetitive, and to make the transition, we're facing increased energy use, which would, at the moment, make us fall flat on our face. So without action to drive down the electricity price and to, in the medium term, the short to medium term, drive down the gas price, the industry remains at risk. So it's really, really critical that we get the energy price situation right. We were pleased to see mention in the industrial strategy and in the Scottish climate change plan. Note your point that it was a very small section on reducing the electricity price, but I think you do make it clear that a lot of it is reliant on national policy action, and that is key. And your pressure on Westminster in that area is really useful, and we thank you for that. If I can pick up the electricity points, you mentioned that high heat temperature processes often don't have off-the-shelf technology that can be deployed using electricity. So it is the case in our sector. High heat processes like cracking, for example, you've got ethylene production in Grangemouth that relies on high heat cracking. And there is not an off-the-shelf technology, as there is in the steel sector, like electric arc furnaces for the cracking of ethane into ethylene. There are various conglomerations of chemical companies working towards this, but they're still pilot scale. There's nothing that you can buy that you can plug in and play. And if you could buy it and plug it in and play it, you wouldn't do it here because the electricity price is too high. So in the interim, that's why it's so fundamental that the Acorn cluster gets that funding to deploy that hydrogen network so that we can start putting that hydrogen into those high heat processes in Grangemouth and start building out some of those projects that were identified in Project Willow. Just in terms of the electricity price in general, it's not just the electricity price versus the gas price here. These are global firms that are looking around the world at where they invest, and we can have the cleanest electricity here, but if it's not competitively priced, they're going to invest in electricity-based chemical production elsewhere because they're looking for competitively priced electricity to underpin that manufacturing. So you've got to look at versus gas in the UK, but you've got to look at versus electricity elsewhere. And what's keeping the cost high? It's everything everyone's already said, but it's also the policy cost. No one's mentioned that yet. So we have subsidies for the deployment of renewables in the UK that are currently paid for on the electricity bill. There is support for some, and there is more support coming for some to remove that policy cost from the electricity bill. But more is needed, and that support is needed for more firms as well. There's also
Mr. Woolley, apologies. We've got a lot of questions to get through, so and I'm sure you'll have other opportunities. And I did, just before I move on to Michelle Thompson, just want to bring Stacey Dingwall in. I mean, again, I just, Stacey, would like to ask you. I mean, coming back to my original question, you know, the vast bulk of private businesses are small businesses in Scotland, and I think a lot of small businesses really struggle to understand what they're supposed to do. And actually what the plan is and actually is there support there. Do you think this draft climate change plan moves us forward in providing clarity for small business, or is there still work to be done on providing that clarity for small businesses?
Thank you. Yeah, I think you've captured it pretty well. You know, none of our members have spoken to me about the draft climate change plan. You know, you often get, you know, you just wanted this consultation, are you on this? No one has mentioned this. I think it's very far removed from the everyday life of most small businesses. I mean, obviously, FSB represents all small businesses across Scotland, so we've got members who are really involved in this stuff, you know, at the cutting edge, delivering some of the stuff. But I mean, the vast majority, when we surveyed them last year, asked them to describe their understanding of government targets around net zero. Under 25% said they had a clear understanding, with 2/5 said that they had absolutely no understanding, and getting on for 90% said that they've never engaged with any kind of government initiatives around net zero. So I think in terms of this plan, I think it falls into that trap of, it talks about business and it assumes that business is all the one thing, whereas, you know, we can break it down into different sectors, different geographies, but you actually need to break it down by size of business as well. Because I think most small businesses, when they hear about, you know, net zero climate change, they just assume it's going to be a burden for them. It's going to, you know, it's going to inflict more costs on them. Whereas we know there's actually a lot of opportunities in there for them. So what I think this plan probably would have been better doing, you know, there's good things in there in terms of, you know, it talks about apprenticeships and support for employers. But again, I think it's probably too much narrative still, too descriptive. There's not that concrete information that, you know, a small business owner would need in terms of if they're planning for their business or thinking about how they might pivot their operations. I don't think it has moved us on enough in terms of giving them that confidence in order to feel more engaged and make more plans relating to government policy.
Thank you very much. And can I apologise to members for spending longer with my questions than I intended? But with that, can I bring in the Deputy Convener, Michelle Thompson? Michelle's muted. There we are.
All right. OK, thank you for that. Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person. I just wanted to return, I think it was Paul, Professor, that you alluded to at the start. And I wanted to ask probably, you know, rather than the SMEs, I recognise the comments that's been made by the FSB, but I wanted to draw your attention to the Fiscal Sustainability Perspectives Climate Change Report of March 2024 from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I don't hear it talked about often enough, but fundamentally it made clear that the need for additional spending in Scotland is estimated to be 26% higher per person in Scotland than the rest of the UK. And it also made clear that the existing fiscal framework, i.e. transfers from UK government to Scottish government, is not set up particularly around the use of capital to allow for the persistency needed year on year. And just to put in the record, they estimate that to be an additional £700 million needed each and every year. That's against the current Scottish government budget of £450 million a year, and with a further £21 billion on mitigation required over the next 25 years. Now, I appreciate we could have a discussion about who spends this money, how is it spent, the role of business, and so on. But what I wanted to explore with the relevant people in the panel is the extent to which you're aware of this report, the extent to which you're aware of these compelling figures, and therefore your reflections on what a critical oversight it would be not to reflect on the money requirements of any plan coming forward. So perhaps one of the professors would like to come in first on that. Thank you. Paul, I think you're looking like you're eager
jumping
to...
in. I'm not familiar with the Scottish Fiscal Commission's plan, so I'm sorry I can't comment on that. But I think the point you raise around the funding required is very, very real. And we actually have some learnings in the past. And again, you know, if we all here are all consumers in our own mind, but if you look at the implementation of things like smart meters in our home, the implementation of fiber, the implementation of water meters down south, it is really hard to do. So there's an element where you need to do something with business, and there's something you need to do with consumers. It is really hard to make these changes happen. And that's what I said in my opening remarks. I think we absolutely need to prioritize and play at big scale. Don't try to do everything all at the same time. Try to do a number of things that make a really material impact. If you look at the areas identified, and I said in the climate change plan, there are 3 areas which represent 60 or 70% of the emission reductions. I would say focus the 5-year windows on these elements, what's going to make the biggest difference the fastest. Don't try to do everything all at the same time, all at once, because it's just money is not available. It spreads too thinly. So I would think there's an opportunity to tweak it a bit. You still get to the same outcome. The destination doesn't change. It's the journey, how you're going to get there, which I think is, and I think all the comments I heard from the panel, all the comments from my own experience, and what you mentioned, Michelle, from the fiscal committee, is all pointing in the same direction, is have a sensible plan. When I read it, I had what I call in my own world, forgive me if I use the language, in a little IKEA moment here. I know what the starting point is, which is a flat pack. I know what the end point looks like is net zero, but what I'm missing is the instructions and the plan in the middle. And what I really want to make sure, if we want to have something credible, we need to make sure we manage this and have that credible plan in the middle. What I quite like, UK government has mission control. What I think Scotland needs is emission control. It's something who looks at nothing else at driving these emissions and really look at that on that kind of annual 5-year basis to drive that down. But I would prioritize, spend the money wisely. We just not have enough money to do all this. This is a hugely expensive thing to do, and we need to make sure it is acceptable to both the business industry, but most importantly, the consumer. Somebody's going to have to pay for it, and money is really tough. So I would say your steer is right, your guidance is right, but I think that needs to now turn into a kind of actionable plan with visibility and measurable outcomes.
And I can see Professor Turner wants to come in, but before I do that, can I just gently challenge you? I totally agree. Clearly, a prioritisation process needs to take place. That's how you would, that's how you would make progress in any substantive project, and you don't get more substantive than this. But the point I am making is that the fiscal framework, the fiscal transfers to the Scottish Government are so limited, and they, as it stands at the moment, have not baked in the estimated figures, even to allow crowding in private capital. It's just not being considered as part of the fiscal framework. And it seems to me to be quite a fundamental impediment to even allow a prioritisation process that you're setting out. And surely that must be a concern.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think connecting these dots between the outcome, the plan, the investment, the activity is absolutely right. And again, the plan without money is not a plan. It's just that's hope, right? And so I think it is really important that what you're saying is we connect the dots. It's a credible plan, but it cannot be an annual plan. This is multi-year funding. This is about the next 20, 25 years. So I think funding is key. Sufficient funding is key. Prioritization is key. So I think we're vitally agreeing. We just might use slightly different words to get there.
Yeah, and Professor Turner, I know you want to come in as well.
I'm mute. Oh yeah, I'm done. Yeah, I mean, I think the same. I haven't read that particular document ahead of coming on this meeting, Deputy Convener. But I think there is a very important point here around, capital spending and the way that the Scottish budget is configured. And I think, one of the major issues has actually been annual funding. There have been a lot of limitations in how the Scottish Government has been able to intervene because they're working with an annual budget. So it's not just about the absolute amounts, it's about when you're able to spend and plan forward. So, and I think, again, to have a proper climate change plan, there needs to be, not just the money behind it, but the actual process by which things are going to happen. We're in a situation at the moment that really you have reserved control over the kind of upfront costs, the capital costs and things like that. And so it then comes down to its coordination between the Scottish and the UK governments. But where there is policy, this has always been peculiar, that the Scottish Parliament has devolved responsibility for reducing emissions, but doesn't have all the levers and actions. So I think this is an important point. And that thing about the annual budgets and the annual spending, it means that the Scottish Government cannot make commitments against which commercial actors, from small businesses to larger businesses, can actually make some of these investment decisions.
Thank you. Both of you make a compelling point about the need for a multi-year view, which doesn't happen at all. And the reason I'm raising this is that the Scottish Government and the UK Government are talking about revisiting the fiscal framework again, and the Finance Committee, of which I'm also a member, has given some suggestions about that, and the multi-year funding, or the need to be excuse me. This is why I'm off today. The multi-year funding, or the need for it, is a compelling proposition. I wanted to give anyone else in the panel the opportunity, if they wanted to come in and give some further reflections. I don't know whether, Richard, you have a view from the points I've made about capital as well. I can't see anybody else in the panel just now because I'm online, but thank you, Professor Turner.
Yeah. Thanks. It's David Thompson here. Just from a smaller perspective, I think, than we've been talking about, not necessarily aware of the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report, but it's very clear from individual business costs that the cost of all of this will be very, very expensive over the next few years. A large biscuit bakery could see costs in the range of £10 to £35 million for, excuse me, for full decarbonisation, depending on the site size and complexity. So if you multiply that up along those kind of figures, then you get to quite a lot of money. And one of the things that I guess we would say in response to the climate change plan is, the importance of industry which is already embedded in Scotland, like the food and drink industry, which is 30% of Scotland's manufacturing turnover comes from the from the food and drink industry, and it's that transition, that change, and those adaptation, which I think Professor Deleu has already mentioned. There's not necessarily enough there about adaptation to the changes that will be required. We are lucky enough in FDF to host the Scotland Food and Drink Partnerships Net Zero programme, which gets support from the Scottish Government. But to go into that at a very micro level for that programme, we don't know if we have funding beyond the 31st of March because of the annualised nature of this work. And of course, that's a 10 to 15-year programme to support, number one, baselining in the industry, number two, a transition plan for the industry, working across all the partners of Scotland Food and Drink, which is the whole of the food and drink industry in Scotland. And we need those kind of long-term levers. And if you go into things like the Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which has been the Scottish Government's response to supporting, in general, larger businesses with their decarbonisation journey. Number one, we don't know if there's any money coming into that. There's ideas for the next stage of that fund. We'd like to see it come down to smaller businesses, if at all possible. But again, without long-term funding and long-term support, it's very, very difficult for businesses to be able to plan and understand the support that may be available there. And so you get situations like we had this year, where the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund was reopened in a 2-week window for people to get their bids in. And it's that kind of thing that does not allow for proper business planning over a long term. And as we've already discussed, as I've already said, these are long-term investments for businesses.
Okay, that's very compelling. I don't know if anybody else in the panel wants to come in, but if not, I'll leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to bring in Lorna Slater.
Thank you very much. with the convener's indulgence, I'm actually going to ask a supplementary to Michelle Thompson's question before I go on to my questions. My question is about net costs versus gross costs of the investment required for decarbonisation, because I think we all agree that there is investment required, but this is a long-term project, as David Thompson has mentioned, and within that time, factories will have end-of-life equipment, there will be normal maintenance and repair and so on. So when we're talking about these large sums of money, and they will definitely be large sums of money, there will also be some natural attrition of equipment that needs replacing that would be part of any normal business planning. And of course, there would be some amount, some fraction of savings from insulation and efficiencies and so forth as we go forward. So when sums are being quoted, are they net or are they gross?
If you're asking me directly about that, I don't know the answer. If that is a net or a gross cost, it's been quoted to us by a member, so that's there. And you're absolutely right to say that there will be natural wastage of equipment and energy efficiency measures, circular economy measures, waste reduction measures, on-site renewables, a whole range of different things within the site. So all of that is part of the investment decision that businesses make. I think, though, that we've already heard significant evidence about the cost of electricity. And I think that is the thing that stops people making those decisions, delays decisions, and maybe, if things really need to be replaced, does not necessarily result in people making the best decisions for net zero over that longer term because of the electricity cost.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to come around to one of my frustrations with this plan, which it sounds like Professor Dulu has a similar frustration, and also Ms. Dingwall, is that it's not specific about different businesses. We know who the big polluters are in Scotland. You can Google a very quick list. Peterhead Gas Power Station, the Ineos Grangemouth complex, although that will have changed since this list has been compiled, Mossmoran, the Shell Fergus gas plant, Tarmac Cement Works, and then a whole host of biomass and waste incinerators, whiskey distilleries and glass plants. And that's before you get to a typical small business. So I guess I would assert that we know where the big polluters are. It isn't your average everyday small business. It's those big guys. And any climate change plan that doesn't sit down with those big businesses and go, well, what's your plan for decarbonising, isn't worth the paper it's written on, because they are the ones that are creating the pollution and they are the ones that are going to have to fix it. And to some extent, there's a frustration, I think, broadly, is that these are businesses with very broad shoulders. They don't need government handouts. So I don't know what your views are on how we tackle those big polluters, how we prioritize those, how do we lean on them to come up with a plan to tell us how they're going to reduce their emissions, rather than making small businesses feel like they ought to be doing something when they're not really the problem.
You want me to start?
Please go ahead, yeah.
There's a lot to unpack in your question, so let me make a couple of observations. There are certain things which aren't going to happen naturally. It doesn't need any government intervention. Oil and gas industry will decline. That's the nature of the beast. We already heard the announcement around Mossmoran. We see the kind of reshaping of the whole Grangemouth cluster, and knows how Richard can add more in there. So that's already happening without government intervention elements. But I think we need to be very mindful around collectively, not only for your question, is around the language we use. Because we say we're using fossil fuel. Fossil fuels are actually not the enemy. It's the emissions from fossil fuels are the issue here. Right? So this really is we can decarbonize fossil fuels, and actually you can actually by carbon capture and storage and other elements, we can still use the energy content as long as we don't have the emissions to go with it. The enemy is the emissions from fossil fuels around the fossil fuels ourselves. So it is about we need to do it from an ecosystem designed in such a way. If we really have a kind of a cluster where we can inject carbon capture and storage, we can do it at scale, we can decarbonize big industrial clusters, we can actually make quite an impact. If you look at the International Energy Agency, there is no way globally we can get to net zero, same from the UK, without carbon capture and storage. There are certain elements we have to do, they have to be part of the mix. It is not just about companies saying is you need to do certain things, it's collectively you need to put the infrastructures put in place. So I do think there's an element around, yes, there are a number of our organizations, if you start there, back to my prioritization list, you make a bigger impact. but we also need to make the tools and the infrastructure available to these companies to be successful. And again, I use the Acorn as an example. We've been talking a very, very long time around it as a potential cluster. But if we really want to be serious in this game and really want to play, we need to make sure that we have all the tools in the toolbox we're using here, including carbon capture and storage, so that we can actually not just electrify things over time, but in the interim, we can take the emissions out and store them. So we actually can do all the different things, opportunities we have to make it happen. And that would make a huge difference. There are 6 big industrial clusters in the UK. There's only 1 in Scotland. We have to decarbonise these clusters if we want to get anywhere near the plan. And that, for me, is in the detail of the implementation plan. In what I see things like emissions control equivalent of whatever we're going to put in place in Scotland to do, because that is really what's going to make the difference.
Does anyone else want to come in on my question?
I think Richard Woolley was hoping to come in.
Brilliant. Go ahead, Richard.
Hi. Sorry, just picking up on your previous question as well, which was originally what I put the R in for. And then the chap from FDF had mentioned investment cycles and whether they align with technological possibility. And it's not just electricity price that is a barrier, it's connection. So whether a site is actually able to connect heat demand to the electricity grid. So some of these sites have, all of the sites in our industry have a much larger heat demand than electricity demand. That's the rule of thumb. And then suddenly, if you want to electrify that heat, you're asking for a much, much bigger connection to the electricity grid, which often requires investment, around the grid in terms of reinforcement and new infrastructure. So those connections aren't, always available at the time at which it might be, from an emissions perspective, the best, or a policy perspective, the best time to invest in fuel switching to electricity. Just in terms of your last question, I guess there's the concept of public goods. So those businesses wouldn't be there in the first place if UK government hadn't built roads, hadn't educated local people, hadn't built electricity infrastructure, hadn't built gas infrastructure. They just wouldn't be there. And this is kind of an extension of that. You're looking at the new industries, you're looking at the new modern infrastructure, and the modern infrastructure being carbon capture equipment to help us recycle carbon in the economy, and to displace new extraction. And hydrogen infrastructure, which can be used both as a feedstock and as a new energy source. And that hydrogen, can go into new fuels as well, e-fuels, sustainable aviation fuel. So these are modern pieces of infrastructure that if the UK government invests in, the expectation is you then have foreign direct investment in the UK, because they see this as a place where there is competitively priced access to clean energy infrastructure. So that's what we're targeting, a place where people want to invest because clean energy is available and emissions infrastructure is available. The other thing is that we have to recognise that businesses invest where they can make money, and at the moment these businesses that are being asked to transition are hanging on. To be honest, you're seeing the site closures in our industry nationally. It was basically one a month last year, and these are big sites producing chemicals that in most cases they were the last site producing that chemical in the UK. So we're now reliant on imports from the US, China, Middle East, Russia, and it's unclear whether that investment will ever come back unless we can make this a place that is investable for manufacturing. It's not just our industry, but we're the canary in the coal mine because we're so energy intensive. And you saw it first with steel. They're above us and they fell over first. And now the government has had to pay for them to change because there's no business case to do it here. And it's the same with us. We lost all our ammonia plants. And now, to grow our food, we import our fertilizer from global markets. And that's places where gas is cheap, the US, Russia, Middle East. That's how we grow our food now, and it's going to be the next most energy intensive site next. So it's the crackers, and we've already seen Moss Moran go. I think it's those two things. It's recognition that we need as a nation to decide what we want to look like and whether clean manufacturing is important. If so, we need energy and emissions infrastructure that reflects that so businesses can invest. And we need to recognise that businesses invest where they can make money. So it needs to be competitively priced and accessible at the right time.
Okay, understood. So going on then to the credibility of the emissions, the negative emissions technologies. As I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected if I've misunderstood, there's essentially two sort of flavors of negative emissions technologies. One that you would attach to a specific installation as an interim measure. To deal with the emissions of that specific site, perhaps through a chemical process or some reverse process. And the other version is is a bit more hypothetical, where you take those emissions and stuff them back under the North Sea and hope they stay there. Have I got that right? And how credible are those two different pathways? Because I heard Professor Dulieu talk about a net zero technology or net emissions technology, as an interim solution. And for key industrial sites, I would agree with that as an interim solution until we can get the electrification going. But I'm very, very skeptical, because it has not been proven, of this idea of long-term carbon storage under the North Sea.
Yeah,
that's right. Sorry. Please, Richard.
So I think you were coming back to me. Is that right?
To both of you, but please start, Mr. Woolley. That's fine.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not in the carbon capture and storage industry, and I'm not an expert in long-term geological storage. In the chemicals industry, we see that as the least valuable place to put carbon that you're capturing. You've already extracted this from the ground, and it can be used to make new products instead of extracting more fossil gas from the ground. So you can use that to make things. You can capture it and use it, and it can be captured end of pipe. Whether it's a long-term solution, I mean, obviously, in a world where you're no longer burning fossil fuels, what are you capturing? I don't know. These are very long-term questions, but in the immediate, here and now, it is, one of the obvious solutions to stop this getting up into the atmosphere. And if you are stopping it getting into the atmosphere, use it for something to create added value for the economy, because that is displacing emissions coming from new linear fossil fuel extraction. And in terms of, so that's end of pipe capture. And if you're talking about drawdown from the atmosphere, I mean, the UK... I'm UK policy specialty rather than Scottish, so apologies if I always talk about UK policy, but there is an emphasis on waste incineration, and now bringing it into the UK emissions trading scheme means that there will be an emphasis on catching emissions from incineration. So those residual things that can't be recycled or aren't recycled for whatever reason, for a long time into the future will be burnt. And we should absolutely capture the emissions from those waste incineration plants, and I would argue use them to make new products rather than burying them. But I'm not from the carbon capture and storage industry, and I don't understand it as well as other experts would.
Thank you, Professor Dulieu.
Yeah, can maybe add a few dimensions. First of all, from a global and UK perspective, because the UK is a bit of a microcosm, 70-75% of the primary energy we use in the country, in the world, comes from hydrocarbons. We like it or not, that's our starting point, right? Again, we all have a destination to get to net zero, but that's a starting point. So my argument is carbon capture and storage is hugely important, because as we transition the world, the UK and Scotland, to a lower energy future, you don't want to put these emissions into the air if you can capture them initially. Two big, there's a whole bunch of technology, but I picked the two big ones for the interest of time. The first one is where you capture at the point of where it is generated. So literally, you put it on the back of a gas-fired power station, or in other countries, coal-fired power station. You take the emissions and then store them. The other one is direct air capture. I'll come back in a second. Now, why do I think it's important? It is actually working. There's not many plants working. There's a plant working in Norway, been working for many years, successfully capturing it. So the technology is there. It is expensive because, of course, you need to put a price on carbon. It's back to the business case. Is it going to, companies only invest if it makes money? So it's doable. Is technology there? Yes. Is the economics there? No, that needs support. But again, that's not unusual. The other method is direct air capture, where you actually literally capture the air in there. Now, why is that tricky? Because I got just round numbers, because I don't have all the numbers in my head, but there's roughly around If you look at carbon in the air, it's about 430 parts per million. And again, the numbers go up and down, so forgive me. Put it into real language, we all understand that is 0.04% of what is in the atmosphere around us is carbon. So you need to treat an awful lot of air to get the carbon out. And that's a really big element. It's a volume question to get the carbon out. And then you can store it. So the most efficient way is to capture it at the point of release. That's the best way to do it, right? And that's where I see a lot of focus going on. Now, I think if you want to say is the cavalry is coming with new technologies, electrification, solar and wind. If you think about it, it's coming, right? We have done more solar in the world in the last 3 years than we have done in the previous 6 decades. Wind story is also developing. It's coming, but it's going to take time. It's going to take investment. It's going to take implementation. So in the interim, we need solutions to make sure we don't take from the primary energy we use around the world, the UK and Scotland, we put the emissions in the air. So therefore, carbon capture and storage is part of the solution. But when you have decarbonized the input, of course, you don't need to kind of decarbonize the output anymore. So it is really important we do it, but we need to be more focusing on both decarbonizing existing processes as well as, of course, take the carbon out in what is already in the air at the moment.
And just my final question to the whole panel, and please feel free for anyone to come in, is really just a general one around credibility. Does this climate change plan from the Scottish Government look credible? I note that in several cases they are kind of kicking the can down the road a bit compared to what the Climate Change Committee have recommended, starting later, catching up later. Is that credible? Is that more realistic? Are we on the right track here? Go for it, Professor Dooley. Or sorry, David, you haven't had a chance.
Sure. So, if you look at it from the perspective of the food and drink industry and food and drink businesses, there is significant pressure in the supply chain already. So, supermarkets, wholesalers and others are making demands on their suppliers, the manufacturers and the farmers on what their plan is to halve emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2040, because that's what the supermarkets have said. So I have lots of businesses, and we work with lots of businesses who are grappling with that as the buyers are asking them these questions. And I suppose you're right to say, and that leads to investment in businesses and a whole range of different ways that businesses are adapting. I think those businesses, though, would struggle to see how the activities set out here are accelerating their path or helping them. And I think that's probably the bit where, as we've discussed, I think already on this panel, where that link between the plan and then the actions that businesses will see support, whether that's financial support or policy support or legislative support in all this, is actually coming through in a way that will help them make the change quicker in order to stay on supermarket shelves. So that's the big kind of fundamental question that we would ask of the plan, is how is this going to help us?
Great. Professor Dooley? Yeah.
So, as I said in my introduction, I think this is an emissions reduction plan. It's not a climate change plan, because we don't talk about resilience, adaptation, all the other bits what we need to do. And again, think about what's happening. You know, you think about the electricity system. Think about what's happening. I live in Aberdeen. You know, the kind of weather elements we need to deal with, which is a resilience issue. You look at the water system, more water coming out, adapting our sewage systems for all that stuff. None of that is kind of cash allocated in the plan. So I think it's an emissions reduction plan. What for me is still an opportunity to add to the plan. Again, there's a consultation, so therefore there's an opportunity to add things to the plan. It's what I call a Google Translate function. It's basically saying is, okay, we have a plan here. What is it going to actually mean for businesses? What David described, what Tracy described, what Richard described, what Karen described. I need to build a Google translation service and saying is actually over the next 5 years, this is what's going to happen naturally. We're going to actually, oil and gas is declining. We see other things being closed down. Don't need government intervention. Where we do need the government intervention, be really clear what it is. So I think that Google Translation Service is something which maybe you need to go back into the consultation saying is, okay, this is the specifics we need to do. Business-like specifics, business-like really clear elements, but you need government sets policy, regulatory framework, business delivers. It's not for government to do so. So I think actually that really clarity would help a lot of the businesses, but I would, as said before, prioritize it. Don't do everything, everywhere, everything at the same time. It's just too overwhelming. It's not really a clear focus. So that's what I would add to the plan.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in before you?
I think overall I would probably say that in terms of credibility we're starting from quite a low point. you know, I said that a majority of our members won't be aware of kind of policies and plans around this. What they'll probably be aware of is that we've missed quite a lot of targets already with relation to climate change. They'll be aware that the Heat and Buildings bill has been dropped, so that's kind of been kicked down the can as well. So I don't think that there's anything in here that will change that. You know, to go back to your point there about making the distinction between the large emitters and small businesses, I think that was our main problem with Chapter 7, that chapter that looks at the negative emissions technology. There's still not enough distinction in there between the two. So I think if you're a small business reading this plan, you'd think, well, the government still isn't getting what it means for me and my business and making that distinction between large and small. So in terms of credibility, if I'm looking at it as a small business, no, I don't think this plan moves us on, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just add, I'm very much enjoying Professor Liu's analogies. We've both had the IKEA flat pack instruction manual and now Google Translate as being the solutions in this area. I'm looking forward to what further analogies we get. I'd like to turn to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Before I come on to ask about the issue of costs in more detail, I wanted to just pick up one point from the questioning from Lorna Slater, in particular to Richard Willey, when he's mentioning the chemical industry. I represent Mid-Scotland and Fife, and if I look at the area I represent, 25 years ago in Fife, paper making was a very large part of the local economy. And you had large companies like Tullis Russell in Glenrothes that were major employers. These have all gone now, and they've gone because of high energy costs. And just as Richard was referencing the chemical industry, we've seen the same in steelmaking, metals, other industrial sectors. Now, we haven't stopped using these items. We haven't stopped using paper. We haven't stopped using metals. We haven't stopped using chemicals. All we now do is import these components from other countries. So the net emissions from these industries haven't gone down. We've made ourselves look good because our emissions have reduced. But all we've done is export that to other countries, and we've lost the jobs and the investment that came with these industries. So can somebody explain to me what the benefit is of exporting our carbon emissions to other economies if we're still using these products? And referencing again what Lorna was asking about large emitters, we could get rid of our large emitters tomorrow if we just close them down. That would make us look good. It would make our emissions reduce, but it doesn't do anything for the planet and it doesn't do anything for our economy. Anybody got to disagree with me?
I'm not going to disagree, and I wouldn't be able to get into what the benefits are, but you know, it's not just employment that's lost, I guess, in the area as well. It's the supply chain opportunities for small businesses that are lost when those go as well. So, it can't just be as black and white as that. We get rid of them because it has the knock-on impact. We're seeing that, you know, Grangemouth, Moss Moran have been touched on. The supply chain, the wider small business supply chain, is hugely affected by those large organisations going. So, I think that's just another point to consider as well.
Can I? Sorry, is that all right, Convener? Is that all right? This conversation is very live in the UK and Scottish oil and gas industry at the moment. It's because it's a classic example, exactly as per your question. So, as a country, and again, numbers fluctuate a little bit, we consume around 2.5, 2.6 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent a day, and we produce about 1 million. So, 40% comes from the UK, 60% we import, and again, it fluctuates a bit. But we're actually kind of accelerating the decline in oil and gas, and actually basically take a supply chain, take our jobs, and actually shifting it and importing it. Demand hasn't gone away. So it's a classic example what you describe in history. History repeats itself, what we're currently doing in the oil and gas industry. And it has consequences because actually when we don't have produce it here, we're going to import it, often at higher carbon footprint, depending on where it comes from, particularly if it comes from LNG, from natural gas from the United States or from Qatar. We're actually repeating that pattern again. And I think a good part of good policy, making is actually thinking about this, and Richard already mentioned, what country do we want to be? And how do we want to make sure we keep the well-being and welfare of our people in mind? The jobs are there, the value is there. So I think actually having an industrial base with high-quality jobs is hugely important. And we're risking by repeating that pattern again. So I think there's a really a fundamental question in my mind, and again, when I read the documentation, it is not all about emissions. It's about the economy, It's about the jobs. It's about the social fabric of our society. It's all these elements in there. And I do worry when I see about you see things like Mosmoran going, you see Grangemouth going, we're seeing oil and gas industry disappearing or declining. We're actually taking industrial capacity out, but actually we're not replacing it with something else. And that is a real worrying element, which for me sits in this conversation. It is not all about emissions reduction. It's the holistic balance of what is the kind of Scotland in 2035, 2045 going to look like. And when we sit here, all about 20 or 19 years older than we are now, are we proud of what we have achieved?
Mm-hmm. Okay. David?
Just build on that from a food and drink perspective. I mean, there is no net zero without food and drink in Scotland, but there is a real question about what do we want to produce here, and do we want to continue producing the same amounts of things, and what does government policy suggest we should do. And that's why the adaptation bit is really important. That's why understanding the needs of businesses, large and small, who are already here and making the food and drink that we're very proud of. Do we want to keep doing that? Because some of the paths that you might take on net zero or on climate change might lead to very different solutions from what we have just now. And so that's a very, very live concern here, and that's why we're doing work across the whole industry to try and understand that and to drive as much reduction in emission as possible, but in a way that is working with the industry rather than to its demise.
Thank you.
Sorry, I believe both Professor Turner and Richard Woolley would like to come in.
Yeah, I think this gets to a central point. I mean, I find this frustrating. When we hosted the COP in Glasgow in 2021, I wrote a blog about the dangers of offshoring. And then coming out of COP 2025, I was more or less writing exactly the same blog, with the industrial installations changing because the announcement about Mosmoran had just been made. I think what's interesting in this plan is that, as the Committee on Climate Change have done as well, it talks about the costs of climate change for the Scottish economy. And yes, that's important, but it's the cost of global climate change. And the frustrating thing is that, we could do everything that we want to do. We could get our emissions down to net zero, but we could still, our own emissions down to net zero, we could still face those costs of climate change if emissions elsewhere in the world are not coming down. So I think really we need to think about what is Scotland's place in this. So when we have sections in this plan talking about the economic opportunity of net zero, that's what we really need to be seizing. We're not going to stop climate change with what we do. We're going to do our share, and that's important that we do that. But I think from a Scottish perspective, we do need to look at this as the wider system. And I'm an economist, and that's how I came into this. How do you, the challenge, how do you have a well-functioning, prosperous economy with high-value jobs, people earning income so that they can pay their taxes, so that businesses can prosper? That's the conundrum that we've got. How do we have that for Scotland? Retain and create new high-value jobs while also getting our emissions down. And, the language about offshoring emissions, that's what gives us the problem in terms of the cost of climate change. But if we are offshoring jobs and GDP, that's why the question that was put by Murdo Fraser is so important. The challenge that we've got here, and why our climate change plan needs to interact with industrial plan, with our economic plan, in terms of the points made earlier about when we get the finances, if the Scottish Government is going to be supporting, how do they do that on a multi-year basis? So, yeah, it gets to the crux. This is a bigger problem than having a climate plan or emissions reduction plan. It is really a Scotland's future plan we need to be looking at.
Richard? Richard, were you wanting to come in?
I was just waiting for my mic to turn on. Thanks. So I mean, it is jobs. These are careers in science and engineering, and these are scientists and engineers that I know that lost their jobs all over the UK last year, and those are jobs making things that we're now importing from China. Europe used to dominate the chemical industry. 20 years ago. It was a global power, and now it is a fading force at best. And the people that have benefited, the country that's benefited is China. So China now dominates global trade in chemicals. It's taken all the jobs we've lost and makes all the things we now buy. So it's high quality jobs and skills that we're losing, and it's capability to support our own resilience. So these are things that you may not notice on a day-to-day basis, but as soon as a pandemic comes along, we're the people that were making the PPE, the disinfectants, the medicines. You have national champions like AstraZeneca coming up with a global first vaccine. So these are really important things to have as a national asset, and I think they've been undervalued. It's R&D. I mean, the industry is, I think, 20% of business R&D spend. It's huge. So we lose this. We're losing innovation, and we're losing patents, and we're losing new technology. And it goes back, I think Paul made a really good point, that one of the key reasons is that we're trying to do everything all at once. And it's very expensive to do that. And it goes back to one of the first points in this meeting, which is the fundamental point that we need competitively priced clean electricity. And that's how you make a transition to a new technology, not by undermining existing assets, not by making what we currently do expensive. That just drives up the cost of living for everyone and drives business away. What we need to do is focus on how do we make the new the cheapest thing, because that's when everyone moves en masse. I don't want a gas boiler because a heat pump's cheaper. That's what we need to target, and that means action on electricity price to drive it down to where it's not just competitive with UK gas, to where it's competitive with Russian gas, US gas. We need to be targeting a really cheap, clean electricity system, and if we can do that, everything else moves, and the rest of the policy, to be honest, you don't need it. It's get electricity right and everything follows. Our industry is slightly different in that we use hydrocarbons as a feedstock, but we can use electricity to make alternative hydrocarbons. So it's fundamental, the electricity point. And I go back to my original point that, we really support the comments that you make in the climate change plan on electrification and the need to drive down that electricity price, but respect that it requires national policy action, and there are other national institutions like NESO, Ofgem involved, and it needs to be a collaborative discussion with all parties to get this done. Okay, thanks, Richard. So everybody's referenced costs. I want to ask a bit more about the costs in the climate change plan, because it's a statutory requirement that the CCP must set out an estimate of the costs and benefits associated with the policies, broken down by reference to the period covered by a Scottish carbon budget in which those costs and benefits are expected to rise. So the legislation is quite clear as to what the plan should say around costs and benefits. Does anybody have a view on whether the plan that's been published actually adequately addresses that? Paul, you're smiling.
Don't know, because it's not in there. I don't know. Yeah. It is hard to judge something which it's not there. Detail is not there. So I think back to the Google Translate function I talked about earlier. We need to know what is in there to do that. The other thing is it's quite tricky. And again, sorry to go in a slightly technical language, but when you do these big projects, until you go out to the market and say how much does it really cost, everything is an estimate, and around estimates are big ranges around it, and particularly when you look at these big capital projects, upgrading a grid, changing around the energy system, building all these wind farms, there might well be in the range around it, but anywhere between plus 50% cost elements in there. So I think really the question for you as a committee is taken back to the officials who've written this thing and wrote the detail and all the behind it, saying is, what is actually behind the plan? Because that's not visible, certainly to people like myself, but also what is the uncertainty range around it? Because one thing what we see happening, and you see it happening particularly in the wind sectors, see it in other sectors, what was the cost base 2-3 years ago is very different than the cost base now. It's gone up quite dramatically, and it's for very good reasons. And again, is this in 2025 prices? Is it clear? I don't know. So I don't know the level of detail, and I don't know what the cost range and uncertainty is. But that's something I think certainly back on the consultation process for the committee to take it back to those who actually wrote the original document.
Okay. I see Karen was nodding away there. I don't know, Karen, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the plan, I mean, for example, tables 1, in table 2 in the paper, you know, they're bringing in costs and financial benefits. I mean, I can't see what's underlying that. I don't know how to read that information. So, you know, my answer would have to be no. I mean, I don't understand the costs and benefits. And I think there are quite strong assumptions underlying them. And I think, like Paul says, having that range, because we have got a lot of uncertainty in this space, you know, is having the range in terms of, you know, kind of, you know, low, high, under different circumstances and things like that. But no, there isn't enough detail in the cost and benefit either, and what underlies them, but actually how to read them either.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I could ask Stacey and David, as representing industries, your members, I imagine, want to do the right thing. They want to decarbonise. They want to help the planet and reduce costs. Do your members have a sense of how they're going to be able to afford to pay for that, and who's going to help them do it?
No. I would say what I was going to say in terms of your questions there about costs are that I think there's, you know, references to, you know, Business Energy Scotland, which was already in operation, as being a key source of support for SMEs and providing, you know, grants or whether it's loans, etc. But, you know, that already exists just now, and I hear from members who, when they contact Business Energy Scotland to try and get support, it can be a couple of months before they hear back from them in terms of getting that ball rolling. And I know that's because Business Energy Scotland is not for them not wanting to support, it's just they don't have the resources. So this plan kind of makes it look as though there'll be a bigger role for agencies like Business Energy Scotland, but then there's no information as to how their resources and funding will be increased in order to be able to provide that support. So no, I don't think we're any further forward in terms of a funding landscape or support landscape for SMEs as a result of this plan.
And I would agree with Stacey. I mean, again, it depends on the segmentation of businesses, and, you know, larger businesses, they have plans, they know where they would like to invest, then they're fighting for the investment, potentially against their businesses in their own company, but in different countries, and therefore the investment case becomes very difficult with the electricity cost so high. But for smaller and medium-sized enterprises, there's actually a raft of support available to help people understand what net zero is, and so on, across chambers of commerce, the enterprise agencies, and others. But actually, when it comes down to the what do I need to do as a business, and can I get some support to do it, then that's, as Stacey said, that's very, very hard to get any reasonable answers out of quickly. And we see things like the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which has supported a small number of businesses, not being available for most of the year, and not having a long-term focus. So, yeah, there's not a clear idea of how businesses will be supported or advised going forward.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to bring in Sarah Boyack.
Right, thank you very much. It's been a really good discussion so far, and I'd like to move us into how this plan, and it's been questioned to what extent is a plan, but how does this link to other government policies? And I wanted to pick on a couple. One was about the new industrial decarbonisation programme, which is critical. And it's the single biggest driver of reduced emissions in this chapter of the plan. And if you look at the stats, it's really significant. Even starting off 26 to 2030, quite a significant increase in terms of emission reduction is the ambition here. But it's the details are really limited in the plan in terms of what this means. And it's really to ask about what do you think the extent of new policies in the draft climate change plan are actually going to deliver. It references the opportunity to unlock significant industrial electrification opportunities, but it's like, where's the detail? And I'm just wondering on your thoughts on this in this section of the plan, the new industrial decarbonisation programme. It talks about a multi-year budget and linking to support for industry to cover a range of decarbonisation technologies to unlock significant opportunities. But there's not much in the detail. So I'm just wondering what you would like to see in the plan, or whether you think there's enough there already. Professor Delou, you're nodding away there. Any thoughts on this?
No, I agree that the detail must be available. Somebody must have built the numbers on something. So again, that is something you may want to question as part of your consultation and response. The nature of the intervention tend to be capital activity. You know, if you want to make a change, you're going to have to invest to do something. Investment drives activity, and then in the end will drive jobs. So if it's capital activity that needs to be planned, it's never happening fast. We see it in the wind industry, we see it in hydrogen, we see it in carbon capture and storage. It's going to take time. So I think back to the credibility, the plan is now framed around 5-year windows. I would go for a rolling 5-year window, so it kind of continues. But I would be really clear within that 5-year window what is going to happen and what is already taking place, what is subject to planning, consenting, and how fast it can happen. My experience, I spent all my life in the offshore energy industry in various component parts. When you do these big projects, it takes a long time before you actually do the front-end engineering and design. You then have a plan, you get approval, you get consent, you're going to then input it into the supply chain and work it. That takes multiple years. So if we're really saying is we're going to do X% reduction by 2030, which is what is currently outlined in the plan, I like to translate it back and saying is show me what you're going to do. Show me the actions, because without that, it's really hard to do. And the other thing for me is really important is follow the money. If the investment doesn't go in, the activity doesn't happen, jobs won't turn up, emissions are not going to play out. So I think actually the ones on the questions I would have, and again, they might already be there because the numbers are built on something, it's just follow the money. If the money's not there, investment's not taking place, then how credible is it? And that for me is, I think, what I think is probably worth investigating.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to come in on this one, Professor Turner, because we have seen massive investment in renewables, whether it's on and offshore wind or solar. So it goes back to that point there about money. There has been money invested. What are the areas we need to see more of this kind of investment if we're going to get the delivery? Because it's really, it looks very small, 2.1 emission reductions, but actually that is the biggest amount in this section, and it really grows over the next few decades. But how do we see this delivered in practice? Professor Turner, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to the point that Professor DeLue was making, I mean, obviously there are underlying data. I mean, I think we run economy-wide models in the Centre for Energy Policy, and we know that the estimated costs and benefits can change depending on your scenario and your circumstances. So I would advise that, you know, there needs to be some running of these numbers under different circumstances, and that might be, you know, kind of if you can get electricity prices down, you know, kind of, you know, depending on what interventions there are, you know, the who pays approach in terms of, you know, carbon prices for key emitters and things like that. But I think, as you say, you know, where does there need to be key investment, and that in turn is going to affect what these scenarios are. Is obviously, you know, we've had offshore wind is very important. You know, we've got a lot of wind. That's a potential for benefit for us, and. But we know that, for example, I mean, I was talking about Shetland and the North East 1 sites. It's not clear that all of the project developers are going to go ahead with their project. So I think in terms of what the pathways are that we're anticipating that could be key in terms of delivery for emissions, but also for economic activity, what needs to be done to make sure that some of the things that we've already invested actually stay on track. You know, we've done the ScotWind process. How can we keep that on track, make sure that the North East 1 sites come off, that they can interact, you know, for example, with the Sullom Voe terminal and what, you know, InQuest and Very Energy have got planned there with low carbon fuels. So I think there is an element of what we've already invested. How can we keep that on track? And what needs to be done, you know, for example, would there be a big change if something can happen on the price of electricity, whether it's decoupling from gas, whether or not it's looking at some private line options so that we can pick up excess. So there's still an awful lot of what if in the area, and I think there is a need to focus in on, you know, things that we're already trying to do. You know, for example, the Acorn project. You know, that situation, we're still waiting for that funding, but that situation is changing. You're getting investors being nervous. We're losing key emitters. Linked to the Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure project that Innovate UK funded around Acorn. You know, we've run scenarios now. You know, what if we don't have all of the emitters? And, you know, if we come to take Moss Moran out and you're onto some of the more central and low cost emitters, the economic benefit of actually delivering Acorn and having that CCUS network in Scotland, that starts to decline. So, you know, what needs to happen to keep the emitters on, to keep the investors in the game? So I think there is quite a lot in terms of what we've already been trying to do and how are we actually going to leverage the maximum economic value and make sure that we get the emissions reduction that we're hoping for and looking for there. And I think, a key thing here is, what Richard was talking about. We've got an industry in Scotland around chemicals that you could be using the electricity in other ways to produce other hydrocarbons through low carbon fuels. What needs to be done to make that happen? And obviously Project Willow was an important step there. How can we leverage what we've already done with the investment that's been put into Project Willow, with investment that's now gone into the activity that's remaining at Grangemouth? How can we actually maximise the benefit of these investments already made?
Yeah. The other question I was going to ask was about the joined-up thinking in terms of the green industrial strategy, which really comes right off the back of your comments there, Professor Turner, because we have had endless discussions about Grangemouth, more recently Mossmoran, but when you look at the opportunities, there are absolutely massive opportunities. Now, the Deputy First Minister described the green industrial strategy as a prospectus approach. There's something about getting that investment actually delivered. And actually seeing those opportunities. So yesterday we did a debate in Parliament on anaerobic digestion. If you told me before the debate that we had over 70 plants in Scotland that actually link food and drink, heat, waste, I would have been quite surprised. There's something about where we've actually got infrastructure, but how do you kick it up to the next level? And the green industrial strategy's got on and offshore wind, carbon capture and storage, professional financial services, we've not mentioned that yet, hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen, potentially at Grangemouth, and then clean energy intensive industries. So it's like huge opportunities. It's like, how do you actually get that investment in there? And it's, to what extent is the draft CCP actually consistent with what's in the green industrial strategy, and how do you get the elements to join up? So I don't know who'd want to kick off. How do we get this to happen? Professor Dillard, do you want to come in? And
I'll just
come
make
back to
a
you,
few
Professor
observations.
Turner?
I think you make a very important point here, but I want to maybe link a few things which are not necessarily linked as clearly in the CCP actually. It's to do with what economy do we want? And then particularly look around what is happening in the oil and gas industry and the supply chain and the workforce which can then transfer to particularly offshore wind, carbon capture, storage and hydrogen. We've done a lot of work in our report called Striking the Balance, we published last year. I know a number of you have seen it, where we look at the decline in the oil and gas industry is happening faster than the new renewables, offshore renewables industries are growing. So we're losing more of the supply chain capacity and the workforce capacity than we can use for offshore wind, for carbon capture and storage. So although the plans are great, particularly over the next 5 or 6 years, we potentially have a risk that we see the Scottish oil and gas workforce, depending on the scenarios, potentially half. And that's a big issue because that's the people in the supply chain who can actually build the wind industry, build the carbon capture and the hydrogen industry. So there's a real issue. And the reason why that happens is because most of the ScotWind developments, the fantastic program, is not going to happen till the early 2030s. So we see one industry declining while the new industries are not ready. So good industrial, a good kind of green industrial strategy would align these things. We call it the Goldilocks zone. You need to get it just right. So as one industry declines and the other one grows, just get your timing right so you can take the supply chain and the workforce across from one to the other. That's not happening at the moment. And again, if you follow the money, it's not happening. We see oil and gas industry declining way faster, far more people coming out who then kind of not going to work somewhere else. Now, we always lost people in the oil and gas industry. We have 25 years of decline, a quarter of a century of decline. That is nothing new. What is new is we need that workforce and that supply chain to build that green energy future for the UK and for Scotland. So we need these vessels, these capabilities to build the wind farms, to build the carbon capture and build the hydrogen. And that's a problem. It is misaligned. So I think one thing we really want to make sure is, if we talk about green industrial strategy, is making sure we align the dots in such a way we can use the industrial base of Scotland to build our new energy future. The prize is massive. If you look at our report where we said striking the balance for the UK, if we get it right, we end up with 40% more jobs. Get it wrong, we end up with 20% fewer jobs. If you look at the current trajectory, we're going towards a lower case rather than a higher case. So there's a massive opportunity to intervene, get the right message in. But it is hugely important because we cannot deliver the net zero outcome unless we have the people in the workforce. Otherwise, we come back to, Murdo, your point is all we do is offshoring it, and we get net zero without industrial base here. And that's a real worry. So I think these things are absolutely linked, but I think it's the role of yourself and the politicians to make that link and then put that integrated plan in place.
So do you think we need more clarity in this? Professor Turner, you want to come in. Manufacturing, for example, massive developments on and offshore for wind, but we don't build the kit in Scotland. We import it all.
Yeah. Yes, and it's not just that. And I think one thing I've holding myself back from getting too technical, but we've got an excellent capacity within your Scottish Government officials and the people who build the input-output tables that describe the structure of our economy, and they do it very well, and they often do it better than the Office for National Statistics do. And over the 10 years that we've had the Centre for Energy Policy, a key thing that we have done is understanding the supply chains and, you know, looking at ONS have produced data around what some of the low carbon activities, offshore wind, onshore wind, what they offer in terms of a multiplier throughout the economy. You know, for every job you've got in oil and gas, how many do you have in the economy? And these are always low. You know, electricity tends to do well. A lot of it's to do with the network. The actual low carbon generation doesn't do as well. Part of it is we're not building the kit. You know, we're not building these turbines. We're bringing them in. And I think, you know, one of the frustrations, I can't remember exactly which industrial dispute it was, but, you know, the point was made, you can see the offshore wind farms from where we're standing. We could be building things, you know, parts of those offshore wind farms rather than just, you know, the kind of end of stage assembly and things like that. We could see that, but we're not making it. It's being shipped across the world, which of course means more emissions. But I think you made the point about financial services. When we've analysed the oil and gas supply chain, a huge chunk of the value in terms of kind of gross value added for the economy, but also in terms of high value jobs, is how the oil and gas industry has used financial services in Scotland and in the UK economy. And sometimes it can be difficult to unpick from the data that the Office for National Statistics produce is, you know, is that a big part of the gap? You know, when we're looking at the low carbon energy production and things like that, are they missing, as well as the building the kit here, are they actually missing part of the link that oil and gas has brought to our financial services? And that's, you know, it's another key strength of Scotland. You know, we've got important financial services centres. Are we getting that linkage? And that all needs to come into the interaction. It's a complex picture to look across industrial pictures and economic and climate. But we've got analytical capacity with the people in Scottish Government who do this input-output accounting. They trace all the linkages between sectors of the economy. So again, to see that coming through in the information that underlies something like the CCP, you know, what have we got and how could we make it stronger? You know, we've produced policy briefs raising this question, making some suggestions, but, you know, that's, you know, you could be picking up on the academic research there as well. You know, the work has been done, questions have been raised. You know, we've pointed to areas that might be important, but financial services is an important one. We often quite rightly talk about the manufacturing supply chain, but what about the role of financial services? You know, is that not being used strongly enough in some of the low carbon developments?
Okay, those points are really well made. The other thing I was going to ask about is there are 4 actions that were Scottish Government committed to, and we've talked about UK Government reducing electricity costs. There's talk about tackling the barriers to decarbonisation faced by energy-intensive industries. There's been a bit of discussion on that. But one of the issues in here, developing a resource, a delivery plan which will identify, target and enable new clean energy-intensive industries to locate in Scotland. We're just wondering what more would you like to see in the climate change plan that actually would relate to the Green Industrial Strategy? You've mentioned supply chain. When we talk to the renewable sector, they always say we need certainty, we need confidence. So there's something about what more could we see in the climate change plan that would incentivise people to actually invest. You know, you've seen some of the National Wealth Fund impact. Is there more that could be done here to give that certainty, whether it's through investors, through different key sectors, to actually get the money going and get those industries actually developed in Scotland, whether it's green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. Any thoughts about that, how this plan could actually be more helpful?
Can I, and again, and maybe if it's all right, I'll speak from an energy perspective. I'll let my colleagues speak from other sectors. But the one thing we found very clearly when we look to our work is that as the oil and gas industry is declining and the renewables is kind of growing, the vast majority, particularly of this decade, between now and early 2030s, most of the wind activities actually doesn't happen in Scotland, happens in the rest of the UK before ScotWind comes on in a big way. So if Scotland wants to win this game, it's going to have to build supply chain capacity in Scotland ahead of activity. And that is a really important one to note, because if not, it's either going to be built somewhere else, and then we will never get it. We will lose the oil and gas industry and never build the next generation of industry. So strategic investment in the future of offshore energy is going to be critical ahead of final investment approval for a project is going to be really key. So Sumitomo kind of conversation, the Aldershire conversation, all the other port conversations is going to be critical if we want to be in here. And I think it is hugely important, because if you think about currently, if you look at the Scottish population, 5.5 million, working population, roughly half that, 1 in 30 people in Scotland currently work or support the offshore energy industry. Where I live in the northeast of Scotland, it's 1 in 6. So you lose that kind of, it is a massive impact. So I think there's a real opportunity. What is in here is start making strategic multi-year investment into critical infrastructure. We're saying is we want to back this. You know, again, you see other countries doing it. There might be intersection in kind of big data centers for AI. Other countries making investment into wind industry. If you think about it, it's hugely critical. If you look from a European perspective, half European offshore wind is going to happen in 5 countries. Half of European offshore wind. It's going to be all the countries around the North Sea. We have to invest at a scale we're not doing. We have to do it sooner rather than later, because otherwise it's going to be based somewhere else. So I think strategically there's a lot to be done, but that is not for me in a CCP. That's an industrial strategy question. That's what Scotland wants to be when it grows up.
Joined up thinking, because earlier somebody mentioned the issue about we produce lots of electricity, but we're not using it when we produce it. So that constraint cost is about 1.5 billion at the moment. So,
and going up.
But getting a more joined up approach. You mentioned data centres, it could be heat. There's all sorts of opportunities in here. I could go on for hours, convener, but I suspect I should hand over back to you to let us move on to the next question.
And given, with an eye on the time, given that we've been asking questions for about 90 minutes, what I was going to suggest is that we take a short 5-minute recess and recommence just after 10 past. Just 5 minutes. So I'd like to resume our questions by handing over to Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really interesting session. There seems to be a coalescing of views from our witnesses. I did resonate with what Murdo was saying about paper making. I mean, I spent my entire career in the paper business and worked for quite a big company. And gradually, over the last few years, they've begun to withdraw from the UK for reasons that I think we've hit on time and time again this morning. But we are focused on scrutinising this draft climate control plan, climate change plan, sorry. And it seems to me that you all seem to be saying the same thing. So from my understanding, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. Are you saying, in what you've said so far in this evidence session, that the plan is lacking in terms of how much, and who pays? Fundamental. Does it lack in how much, and who pays? Paul?
So I think it describes what needs to be done, but I think
it does the what,
it does the what quite well, and it does the when quite well.
Right.
I think there's more definition in my mind required about all the other elements.
Right, so the other elements are missing.
It doesn't say it's not there, because they have to build the cost elements and the timing elements on something, right? These targets are not random.
But it's not evident.
But it's not clear. It might be clear in somebody's spreadsheet, but it's not clear to what is being made available.
Thank you. Stacey, what's your take on my summary of what I'm hearing? Am I understanding correctly from you? It's about how and how much and who pays.
Yeah, there's a lot of narrative there, but I think you're right in terms of the actual details that we need to know. Obviously it covers 26 to 2040. I would imagine we'd need to rewrite this quite quickly, as things, so much of it, as you're saying, is unsaid. This certainly wouldn't take us to 2040. No, it's just a narrative.
And there isn't a lot of time for any further consultation. I mean, it's the end of the month, I think.
Yeah.
The consultation closes. David, is that a fair summary of what I've heard?
I think so. I mean, I think of it through the lens of our members. And so if our members looked at this and said, well, how is that going to accelerate me towards net zero?
Yeah.
They wouldn't have any idea, really, would they? So, yeah.
OK, so that's not helpful then,
no.
In a practical sense, as a plan.
I believe that Richard Woolley would like to come in.
Yeah, I'm just turning to Richard now. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether you want the long or the short of it, but yeah, totally agree. I think it tells us what we need to do, but the key policies outlined in the industrial emission reduction section, they're unsurprising, but they don't explain how we're going to actually deploy those policies and industry is going to comply. To add a bit of colour to that, I mean, one of the key policies there is carbon pricing through the UK ETS. I can tell you, since the UK ETS came in 2021, our sector has a 40% emission reduction all through site closure. So we're well on our way to decarbonisation. Totalis up at Grangemouth. I could take these one by one, but
Richard, I'm going to come back to ETS because that is going to be the thrust of my main question to all of you. But I do want to get a sense of where your evidence has led us to, and I want to be checking that I've understood. And so I'm going to turn to Professor Turner-Carden, if she would give me her take on my summary.
Yes, I mean, I would echo the others. I think if we were going to put it in short language, there's a lot on the what and the kind of intended timing, but there's so little on the how. And I would just note that if you don't have the how, that's going to affect all the costs that you're trying to set out. It's also going to affect the when and what nature of the when. Echoing Richard, you might get the wrong kinds of emissions drops if you do this the wrong way.
Yeah, and however laudable aspirations might be expressed, as indeed you've identified in terms of the what, a plan is not a plan unless it details exactly how you get from A to B, using your very colourful but very pertinent analogy of the flat pack furniture construction, which the convener and I have been discussing during our little intermission, which we enjoyed because it's so illustrative of what what we need to see happen. So that's very interesting. But I was also interested, Paul, in your comments about hydrocarbons and the rate of decline, particularly in oil and gas, because that is a huge issue for the Scottish economy. And I know we're straying into industrial policy, and we've heard that a number of times, and I acknowledge that. But should there be something in terms of policy signals in the CCP that would somehow try and stabilise the decline in oil and gas to allow for the Goldilocks scenario that you're describing? Should there be something explicit about our support for the oil and gas sector?
So I refrain from any political elements. That's why I leave it to yourselves. But I mean, there's a fundamental question here: is if we want to build the right industrial base in Scotland, we need to have a world-class supply chain, a world-class workforce, and a world-class ecosystem. We have that now. If we lose it, it's going to be really hard to reconstruct. There's nowhere else in the UK where this base really exists, particularly in the northeast of Scotland. So, well, what our logic would be as part of a good industrial plan is, if the renewables agenda is ready and you can take it across, please take it across, no problem at all. But it isn't ready. Therefore, please sustain the capacity and capability we have. Manage that Goldilocks zone really well, because by the time you need the capacity and the people and the supply chain, if it's not there, you're going to compete on world markets, and it's really hard to get here. So I do think it is hugely important that we manage this as a kind of a whole economy question. It's not a climate change plan. It's not an emissions reduction plan. It's an economy plan, very much as one of your colleagues mentioned before. So I think this is about green industrial strategy at a mega scale. And I would say is pull all the levers we can get, because again, if we lose it, we ain't going to build it again. Ecosystem will go, people will go. Not that they're not going to work. They're just going to work on overseas activity. It's not there's no investment happening in oil and gas. It just doesn't happen in the UK. It just goes somewhere else. So I would think is we have a world-class system. Use it wisely, don't lose it, and sustain it for as long as we can until the cavalry is ready with a new activity coming in.
Okay, that's a very fair and very clear comment, and obviously tempting you to be more explicit in what you thought should be included in the CCP, but I respect what you said. Let's turn to ETS, because ETS as a policy is going to be elevated over the next period. There's already baked in assumptions about the impact of ETS in the CCP, but there is expected acceleration of ETS, extension of ETS beyond the current three sectors that are impacted by it, namely power generation, aviation, and energy-intensive industries such as steel making, chemicals, and cement manufacturing. I'm going to turn first to Richard, because Richard began to give me the answer to the question I'm now asking, initially when I was asking about the summary of the evidence we've heard. Richard, you said something about the impact of ETS on your sector. Can I ask you to elaborate?
Sure. I mean, the premise of the ETS is that you make emission-generating activity so expensive that people move to the counterfactual, which in this case, for the most of our sector, would be switching a gas boiler for an industrial electricity-driven heat pump. This again and again goes back to the cost of electricity. It's not cheap enough to do that. Therefore, you're stuck on a gas boiler, and then you're therefore paying a carbon price for your emissions. As the carbon price goes up, it becomes less sustainable. It's still not cheaper to switch to electricity. So your only answer is to shut your UK site and to start to make it in the US or China or the Middle East instead. There is a growing body of evidence accessible to anyone who wants to look. If you just go on the emission reports published by DESNZ and have a look at which sites are where the emissions reductions are happening, and you can see whether or not it's because the site closed. And in our sector, if you filter for the chemical sector SIC codes, you'll see that almost exclusively, as I say, about 40% emission reduction since 2021, it's come from site closure, or the closure of production lines within a site. And the only exception, the only site that we have that has managed to decarbonise, it's a huge feat and it should be celebrated, 75% emission reduction by switching to burning hydrogen for heat. That's INEOS acetyls down in Hull. But the only reason they were able to do it was because that was hydrogen they were previously selling to a site next door for ammonia production, but that site was no longer competitive, so it closed. It's not a replicable situation.
That's a form of net zero, isn't it? Where one plant survives because another plant closes. Yeah.
I mean, in theory, the ETS works, just not in a world where it's unilaterally done. So this is not UK, this is not a UK standalone issue. This is replicated across Europe. If you Google ethylene cracker closure, ammonia production closure, these are the high-end energy-intensive processes that form the foundation of chemical production. They're closing all over Europe because we have regionally high gas prices, regionally high electricity prices, and almost unilaterally high carbon price. I think, as I say, the evidence is there. It's not, something I'm saying. It's there in the reports published by DESNZ for anyone to see.
So in these critical sectors, there's effectively a form of deindustrialisation occurring, not just in the UK economy, but across Europe.
That's right. It makes it too expensive to use the existing technology, gas, and because it's too expensive to use the counterfactual electricity, they just shut up shop, and then we import that stuff instead. So the narrative, I think there was a gov.uk press release a few months ago. It said, it was crowing about a 10% year-on-year reduction in industrial emissions in the UK. I suspect 99% of that was site closure.
Right, okay.
May I ask a brief supplementary? Just on that point, is there anywhere in the world where alternative technologies for cracker, I take this as sort of as an example because there are other energy-intensive technologies, but are there places in the world where those alternative technologies are price competitive with gas-based cracking technology or cobalt, i.e., is that a feasible scenario to do a replacement with the alternative technologies, or is that just not where the current kind of state of the art is? And if it's not, how far away are we?
If the question is for me, it is definitely feasible in our sector. It's feasible where you can get cheap renewable electricity, which we should have an advantage in terms of being a wind superpower.
But is it happening anywhere in the world? That's my key question. Where is that happening then? Where electricity-based cracking technology is cheaper and price competitive with gas-based?
So for cracking, it's not happening yet because there isn't an off-the-shelf technology available. So that's in development. There are 3 chemical consortiums that I'm aware of developing technologies. But for example, for ammonia production, electrochemical production is possible, and it is happening places where renewables are cheap. So big producers like Yara, CF have investments in the Middle East, in Australia. These are it's making of ammonia with green hydrogen, basically, rather than taking the hydrogen out of natural gas, which is the traditional method. So, if you can get competitively priced electricity, you can do it, and people are doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm interested, obviously, to hear from David and Stacey about this. Maybe not directly impacted by ETS, but indirectly impacted by it. Is the indirect impact of ETS recognised by the businesses that your organisations represent? Or is it something that is happening in terms of cost impact that is an unknown? Stacey?
I've never had a member discuss it with me. I wouldn't say it's on the majority of our members' radars, to be honest.
Right, okay. But there would be some, presumably, in the cascade of economic impact, there would be some impact to all businesses because of the deindustrialisation that Richard has described.
Yeah, obviously, as part of the supply chain, talked about the impacts of site closures.
But it's not on anyone's radar, basically.
No.
And how about David?
I think there are definitely impacts, and actually impacts on the chemicals industry are really important for food and drink. We've seen stories, you'll probably have tracked stories over the last few years about fertiliser production, ammonia production, carbon dioxide, a whole range of different things that are impacted, and availability can be impacted in the UK, probably mostly on a short-term basis until other elements can be brought in. If it's okay, I'd like to add another thing. The UK government are currently consulting on a thing called the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme, which I think Rich has kind of provided an ancillary note to. But essentially that will allow foundational businesses, including foundational industries, to reduce their energy costs through exemptions from renewables obligations, from feed-in tariff and capacity market costs. So that's to be welcome for those industries. Unfortunately, food and drink isn't in the industrial strategy and isn't one of those industries which could benefit from these kind of that kind of policy. So we are making the case in the consultation, but obviously the importance of food and drink to Scotland would suggest that maybe the UK government should be thinking differently about that as well.
And it's almost a form of acknowledgement, isn't it, that some of these cost impacts have had a huge detrimental effect in terms of business prosperity and business creation, business sustainability.
It's in the name of the scheme.
It's in the name of the scheme. It is. It is. It's a policy acknowledgement. Yeah.
Steve, maybe add a few things to it. It is important to be able to put a price on carbon. And really it's important because it needs to give the right business signal to particularly carbon capture and storage, right? Because the business model doesn't work without a price of carbon. And there's lots of options, but let me give you the three main ways of doing this. So one is a carbon pricing system, which is an emissions trading system, which is the most efficient one. You can do a carbon border adjustment, so you correct it for different countries to do an adjustment at the border, or you can put a carbon tax on people. Whatever it is, it's going to be a burden on industry, particularly large industrial users, right? And we need to be very mindful, again, the cost to industry here. In Europe, we have gone for the emissions trading system because it's the most efficient way of actually putting a price on carbon.
But is it the most efficient if there isn't carbon capture and there isn't cheap electricity?
Yeah, but that's the point. If you
that's the point.
If you want in the future, you want a system that works, we need to have a carbon price which is underpins the model. So therefore, at the moment, the carbon price is too low. There's no price signal to support large-scale carbon capture and storage. But the view is that this emissions cost will go up, the price of carbon will go up, which then sets a signal for carbon capture and storage. Now, there's a lot of ifs in that conversation, but this is where the mechanism is coming in. And again, but whatever happens, it's going to be a burden on somebody. Somebody has to pay for this.
But we're missing your Goldilocks moment, aren't we? Again, in relation to hydrocarbons that we were discussing earlier, you were talking about Goldilocks. There's not a Goldilocks here either, is there? We're not getting this right because we conceive, according to Richard, and lots of other evidence available to us as a committee, there is this deindustrialisation happening across the UK, across indeed Scotland. We've talked about.
Yeah. So get us wrong. You see a deinstallation impact. There's an opportunity to get it right. Again, the question was: is it fair reflected in the CCP? I think there's a lot more to the story than is captured in the paragraphs in there.
But there are missing elements.
There are missing elements which might need an explanation, saying is how are we going to deal with this over these different periods? There might be different choices to be made in the different.
And the policy can get ahead of the reality from a business point of view, can't it?
It's a totality. This is about, again, it's about industrial strategy and emissions reductions is part of the conversation. So I would say it needs to be looked as a complete picture rather than just as only emissions reduction.
But to maximise a positive benefit, you have to have alternatives available so that you can drive good practice, good behaviours, if you like. And at the minute, those options don't really exist. So we've introduced a policy that creates an impact without any means of escape.
Yeah, I think that question is absolutely part of the back to the consultation. I think absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Karen, if I might, to get her input on this discussion so far.
Yeah, I would echo what's been argued so far, and I think there's 2 points to make. I think one is that when we're talking about the carbon price, we're talking about social costs and social benefits, and so that does have implications in terms of who pays for things. So the price of carbon itself could be considered as a social cost, but the kind of benefits or the disbenefits that emerge in terms of kind of employment versus kind of cleaner atmosphere and things like that. So we are talking about a situation where we're talking about the benefits and costs to society. So there is a who pays challenge out of that, and that's why I think a lot of the discussion around taxation, kind of part of the burden being borne because that's how society pays for things. So I think there's that general picture in terms of, because as Paul says, the carbon price has been too low. If it shot up now, all the companies who Richard represents would have even more problems. I think that then takes you on to the international picture, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism is raised in the plan as well. And I know that's been a big focus of policy, and really, and kind of what you want in principle there is that you're getting something that's equalising, so that everybody's paying the cost of carbon, so that it's not cheaper to move production to Southeast Asia or the United States or something like that. But I think that's not a simple thing to do either. We've done analysis, where you bring in some kind of carbon price on imports and things like that, is that a lot of our manufacturers import a lot of their supply chains. So if you start to bring in that CBAM, the kind of international kind of carbon pricing, that could have implications, kind of coming in through the import side and through the upstream supply chain as well as the companies trying to sell their output. So, I mean, really this becomes a complex challenge. It's not something that the Scottish Government or the Scottish Climate Change Plan is going to resolve. It goes back again to this cooperation, and it's interacting with the UK in terms of how they're designing the UK ETS to sit alongside the EU one, how CBAM is coming forward. But then it all, it comes back to the international coordination issue, where we've got the frustration of continued COPs, not really getting to grips with the nitty-gritty of the how in all of this.
I mean, you mentioned CBAM. That acronym obviously is in the Scottish context. It's quite interesting. But Parliament Glasgow and all that. But this idea of CBAM. I mean, Richard, it's not going to do anything for the chemical industry, is it? CBAM, as it currently stands, it's going to destroy the chemical industry.
Yeah, it's quite a funny one because, we were one of the sectors asking for it. We saw it as something that could be helpful. But as with all of these things, the devil's in the detail. And for a long time now, in the design, we've been lacking an export mechanism. So basically, it was brought in with the idea that it would replace the current carbon leakage mechanism, which is called free allocation. And free allocation basically provides you with carbon leakage mitigation, regardless of where your end product ends up. Now, we're an export-focused industry, so that's really important. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, as it was designed for a long time, didn't have that export leakage mechanism. So it would only protect you selling into the domestic UK market, which is not a market for our sites. So it would just result in them closing. Now, recently we've had a development whereby we understand that we'll be able to keep free allocation for the exported product. But that free allocation is still subject to a decline over the next 9 years. And it's unclear whether that is the kind of level of support required to keep industry here, given we have seen such vast closure over the last 12 months. Sorry, there was something else I wanted to add from something you'd said previously, but it's escaped my mind.
That's okay. Everyone's contributions have been very, very helpful. I just think it's somewhat ironic that we have effectively are going to resort to tariff measures in order to achieve something when, given the politics of the last 12 months globally, tariffs.
Stephen.
Yes, Richard.
I know what it is. Sorry, it was that one of the biggest proponents of this scheme of CBAM was the ammonia sector, and it was brought in to cover fertilizers. And by the time it's from concept to implementation, all of our ammonia plants have closed. We had 3, and they've all gone. So it's kind of closing the door after the horse has bolted.
Right.
The hope is maybe we can attract back some clean ammonia production based on green hydrogen in the future, and fingers crossed that will be the case. But it is just quite funny how that materialised.
Convener, I know that one of our colleagues wants to come in and ask further questions on the subject, so I will defer to Willie.
And with that, I'll bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. I didn't think I would hear Parliament of Glasgow mentioned at a committee meeting in the Scottish Parliament, but it's nice to hear that tribute to Stanley Baxter. The whole point about CBAM, as Stephen was mentioning earlier, is we probably wouldn't need it at all if the UK was still within the European Union. I suspect the EU has its emissions trading scheme, and the UK has felt obliged to create or invent our own, as I understand it. And the CBAM arrangement is necessary to try to protect businesses in the UK and European Union from advantaging or disadvantaging one another. But I wanted to ask the panel what their views are on how the UK's ETS dovetails or works harmoniously, let's say, with Scotland's draft climate change plan. It seems to me that if the ETS fails in any respect, then Scotland would have great difficulty complying. So I wonder if the panel would share that view, and whether our draft climate change plan recognises that and what it tries to do to compensate, if at all. Professor Dillou, would you like to start?
Yeah, maybe I would defer to Richard, because I'm not as close to the mechanisms between the countries and how it works in Scotland, how it works in the UK. So maybe people in the chemical industry are probably deal with it on a day-to-day basis. Maybe maybe this one not for me.
Are you, Richard? Then how does the UK's ETS scheme work in harmony, if at all, with Scotland's draft climate change plan proposals?
Well, it seems to be one of the key policies in the plan in terms of reducing industrial emissions. I mean, several are highlighted in the roadmap: UK ETS, CBAM, energy efficiency, the drive for embodied emission reporting. So that's the emissions embodied in imported goods, and a replacement for the IETF. Just putting aside the fact that Scotland has its own IETF, these are all UK policies. The other one is ACORN, we desperately need to see something come forward on that, because trying to keep all those myriad investors interested in such a complex project over such a long time, people will start to walk away. And when they do, it's very difficult to bring that group back together. Planning permissions expire, permits expire, skills leave. And as I say, the time to act on that is now. Unhelpful was that the UK government this summer suddenly announced that it would only support one regional hydrogen network, when we had expected it to support all of the clusters equally, to have carbon capture infrastructure alongside hydrogen infrastructure. So that was a surprise announcement in the summer, and it leaves even the Track 1 clusters, east coast of England and northwest England, in competition for funding for their own hydrogen network. It doesn't affect the carbon capture network, but without carbon capture and hydrogen next to each other, you're limiting the possibilities that we could have, in particular in our sector, where the two could combine as feedstock. In terms of the UK ETS directly, so it's been said previously that climate policy has devolved. So the UK ETS policy making is done by a body called the UK ETS Authority, and that body is made up of representatives from the Treasury, the Department for Energy and Net Zero, and also all of the devolved authorities. But up until now, everyone has basically agreed that it's really DESNZ writing the policy within that body. And one thing that we've asked for is to include the Department for Business and Trade, as well as the devolved authorities, just to give that wider voice to the policy and decision making.
Thanks, Richard. Could I turn to you, Professor Turner? You mean our draft climate change plan kind of assumes that the UK ETS scheme will work. Is that how you see it? And what happens if it doesn't? I mean, can Scotland's climate change plan succeed if that doesn't happen?
But I mean, I think that's, like Paul, I would bow to Richard's expertise in how the UK ETS is actually functioning. But I think that, that's why I said earlier, I think that in terms of the figures and also even the narrative of the plan here needs to look at different scenarios, and particularly ones that have such an important impact, around what might happen with electricity prices, what the different policy scenarios, as well as just the wider the wider picture in terms of the determination of the market price. But, through things like REMA and things like that, what are the different scenarios and how that might affect the plan? And, a similar case for UK ETS, I think, especially given that that's a reserved power, we do need to look at the Scottish Climate Change Plan under circumstances of what if that doesn't work, or what if there is a major change. So I think, in order for this to focus in on what the Scottish Government can do and what can be done at this level, we do need to have both numbers and narrative around what might happen if you have something not functioning properly or if things change.
Okay. My last query really is an ongoing monitoring about how well it's all working or how well it's all hanging together. Who's going to do that monitoring to advise both the governments about progress towards reaching these targets? Who's best placed to do the monitoring and to revise the plans and the targets and schemes and so on as we go forward? Would anyone offer a view on that, please? Richard. Ongoing monitoring. How will we know that we are achieving what we set out to achieve as we progress through this issue?
Sure, yeah, sorry. I was smiling just because I thought the question was to do with the ETS. And in that respect, there is an ongoing evaluation of the scheme, which we've fed into. And we're looking for the results of that, because that will be a public record that shows what I've outlined on the call. In terms of who's the correct body, again, apologies, but I am a UK policy expert, and my expertise is national UK policy. And in that respect, it's the Climate Change Committee who have an industrial lead. And so from my perspective, it's coming from the industrial section of the Climate Change Committee, and it's their job to hold government responsible.
Okay, so Professor Duluth?
Add something to that. I did say it in my introductory remarks. I do think Richard's absolutely right. The Climate Change Committee has a legal obligation to advise the nations and nation-states the progress being made. But I do think if the CCP is owned by the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, there needs to be a body here set up to do this and measure this. I talked about emissions control, right? Emissions control kind of as a surrogate of what emission control that the UK has. What it literally says is actually we're on track, we need to make an element. But I think it needs to go, if you have somebody to monitor it and observe it, they need to have the power to make the intervention. So I think if you have a monitoring organisation, which is in a monitoring framework, you need to have a rolling 5-year plan you can make the intervention in. Because otherwise, by just saying to people, oops, we're not on track, it's actually not that helpful, because that means it has to come to yourself or the government to actually do something about it. So I think actually if you want to build an integrated plan, you need to have a level of detail where you're saying we're not on track, these are the interventions, this is the money that's available to do it, and it allows you to run this as an almost like an outcome-focused activity set. So I think it's really important that you have a plan, monitoring framework, plus intervention, plus a real clarity of what's going to be done afterwards. So I think that is part of this conversation for me.
And Scotland could do that almost independently as we move forward? Is that?
I mean, what I understand, I think that should be totally within the powers of what is in Scotland, yes.
Okay, because I'm conscious, Convener, that in 2-3 years' time, when we have the same conversation, that this committee will possibly be asking these questions about how have we progressed and who is responsible for making that progress work quicker, better, faster and so on. So it's important to have that data at that time so that we can react and respond positively to develop the climate change plan and take it forward. So thank you for responding to my questions. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'd now like to bring in Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I hope folk can hear me okay. I have a number of questions, and some of them are around about the Goldilocks zone that has been talked about, and covering some of the other topics that have been discussed. In terms of the Goldilocks zone for carbon capture, are we nearing the end of that Goldilocks zone? And does the UK government need to take action much more swiftly in terms of making Acorn a reality, or are we going to see investors give their thoughts on it all by leaving the actual project? And maybe Professor Deleuze first, please.
For the question. I think it's a critical window, right? The government has made over 20 billion available for CCUS over the next couple of decades. So there is a notional allocation. It doesn't say it's going to be used 200 million for Acorn itself. But there needs to be confidence that the project happens. I've been hearing the Acorn story for years and years and years and years. We now have seen that the actual operator is selling out their position and moving into other places. So I think we need, if we want to do something, it needs to go really fast. I am personally worried that Acorn is rapidly turning into baby corn. You know, it is really one of these moments you think is it still going to exist in the way we're going to go. So if we believe that CCUS is a fundamental part of decarbonising Scotland, which I think it probably is, we need to make sure, of course, the still CO2 to be captured. We need to go after these projects and have full support across the political spectrum, both in Scotland and the UK, to make it happen and actually just link it in and get the funding to go with it. It has to be part of the plan. It has to be part of the monitoring framework. So I think it is absolutely critical. Goldilocks zone, it's really important. And let me explain why. Between oil and gas and carbon capture and storage, there is 80% of the supply chain in oil and gas can support carbon capture and storage, and over 90% of the workforce skills we currently have in oil and gas can support carbon capture and storage. So actually, it is the most adjacent part to using the existing supply chain and workforce we have both in Scotland and across the UK. So do I think it's important? Oh yes, it's massively important. Is it going fast enough? No, I don't think it is. We'll need the right policy and support frameworks. Yes, it's already there. We just now need to go after it and give it the confidence to invest in.
In your own Striking the Balance report, you highlighted that in the UK, 1 in every 215 jobs is in energy. In the northeast of Scotland, that's 1 in every 6. You have said during the course of this evidence session that we need to be in a position where we retain those skills. There's also been talk of ensuring that the supply chain remains in order to deliver net zero. Do you think that in terms of the level of investment, the logic of all of this, that the UK government has got a real grasp on what it needs to do, and if it does not ensure that there are changes to retain jobs, to retain skills, and to capture investment, that will make it almost impossible for Scotland to deliver on its carbon capture, climate change plan, or as you have termed it earlier, emissions reduction framework. Would that be the case?
So I think there's again a lot in your question. If you don't mind, I'll unpack a little bit. There's some quite unique things happening. What happens in the UK, what not necessarily happens in other places. So, as of the beginning of this year, the UK is the only country in this part of the world with a windfall tax left, which is quite interesting because no other country in Europe has one on any part of the industry because there's simply no windfall tax. And it has consequences because, of course, money is still going to be invested, particularly in the oil and gas industry, but just not to the same extent in the UK. The money is going overseas, which is, I think, quite fundamental. The second thing to note is that the nations around us are changing and have changed their energy policy. So Norway has always been very much focused on energy resilience. They're still producing oil and gas, which is supporting Europe, particularly post the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but using the proceeds of that to accelerate the renewables agenda. Denmark, which is a stalwart of renewables, have redeveloped the Tyra gas field, self-sufficient in gas at the moment, and actually exporting gas as well as doing renewables. The Netherlands announced last year that they're going to selectively develop gas fields in the North Sea to support the gas sovereignty and independence and security. It is quite interesting that we have a unique policy framework that plays out in the UK. Again, I'm not a politician, so I'm not making a political point. I'm just making you a factual point. But the really interesting is around is where do we play our energy policy? And that is quite fundamental because we can't do it all, as I said, all at the same time as everything. We need to be really mindful. What we see happening is wind is slowing down. Not the wind is slowing down, but the wind activity is slowing down and it's moving out in time. Carbon capture is moving out in time. Hydrogen moving out of time. And again, we're back in, if we want to sustain the supply chain, so want to supply the workforce, is really important we think about it. But the third point I want to make on this one, if we don't produce the gas and we don't have the wind farms, where is the electricity going to come from for the country in the early 2030s? Because we probably end up importing it. So as part of energy strategy, energy security, and other things what go with it, energy affordability, this is an integrated policy question, which is hugely important. The reason I raised the Goldilocks zone is because as politicians, unfortunately, that goes with your film star wages, you have to manage that because it's really important that we get this right, because if not, we're losing our competitive edge.
And in terms of striking that balance and ensuring that we don't lose our competitive edge, that should formulate the policies as we move forward. You're painting a stark picture, and I think, rightly so. And you said if we don't get this right, and if we don't get electricity production up, if we see gas declining, if we don't get this right, there is the possibility of us facing energy shortages, is there not?
So again, I'll remind the committee, this is an international market, right? We have export and import opportunities all the time. So will we have an issue? We just need to end up importing more if we don't do it ourselves, right? So we rely on
which increases carbon.
Yeah, in certain places, if we get electricity from France, it won't. If we get gas from Norway, it won't. But if we get it from other places, it might increase carbon. So particularly when we start importing more oil, importing more gas from other places than Norway, we will increase our carbon footprint. So this is about, again, integrated thinking, integrated planning. But it is really important we get this right because, as I said, my job is to go and reduce our emissions on a daily basis, not to increase the emissions around the world by just offshoring it.
Thank you. Professor Turner, please.
Sorry, I was just waiting for my mic to activate. I think, particularly on the point about Acorn, I think, yes. I mean, I think there is, given the centrality in the Scottish Climate Change Plan, but I think overall there is our research has shown that, the economic benefits that we get from having this activity in Scotland, they're higher if we can move at pace. And that's, kind of both in terms of, a full idea of Acorn, which I guess has fallen away a bit with the closure of Moshmoran because you're looking at different emitters being involved. But I think just to highlight, I mean, the evidence is there. There's Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage over at Edinburgh University. There's work that we've done as part of IDRIC based at Heriot Watt. There's what Innovate UK funded in with the Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure Project, which was largely around Acorn. There is a lot of evidence there for yourselves to go and push at the UK government level about getting decisions made on this. I think also we've it's not just about Scotland's emissions. The Acorn would constitute an important and part of the wider UK CCS system. And I think, is remembering other facilities that we might be getting in Scotland, up in Shetland, one of the things that they're wanting to do at the Sullivvoe terminal is carbon sequestration. And, that could provide a backup to Acorn, so it could help make this system more resilient. But again, Acorn could have the capacity to provide carbon storage for other areas in the UK, internationally potentially, but you've still got the London Protocol around that. But, this is potentially, it's not just about Scotland's climate change plan. Actually getting this CCS infrastructure into place in Scotland could be important for the wider UK and for us to maybe set it in the context of Scotland has potentially got a backup up in Shetland and things like that, where it might be a commercial model, which would, limit the requirement for public support. So, yes, I think there really needs to be a push on Acorn. And just to highlight to you, and I'm happy to help anybody out with finding the evidence, there's a lot of research evidence out there to support that argument and go forward to the UK government on it.
Talked earlier, as have others, around about multi-year funding to deliver. because this is all about delivery. And my colleague Michelle Thompson earlier was talking about capital investment and the fact that the Treasury have not been great at multi-year funding, have not given the comfort that a lot of investors will require for some of these big projects. Do you think that the Treasury needs to listen more and needs to pump prime this investment? And beyond that, do you think that the current fiscal framework is fit for purpose? And does that need to be changed so that Scotland itself has the ability to put in place multi-year funding to garner that investor confidence?
Sorry. Okay. Carry on, please.
Sorry, Kevin, I should say we missed the first part of your question because you're on mute. So I don't know if you directed that to anyone in particular.
I think
I'm off mute now. That was for Professor Turner, and then we can come back to Mr. Woolley and Professor DeLue, if you don't mind, convener. Thank you.
Well,
I'm unmuted now, so yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, there's two sides to this. I mean, one is the kind of coordination and kind of cooperation between Scottish and UK levels, and obviously the role of the Treasury, and the other side of it is, where the Scottish Government's going to have to take action, and it's going to be built into this climate change plan, that they at the moment have very limited powers, with a particular problem being the annual budgeting, that you actually just cannot commit to more than 1 year's funding. So I guess, I mean, a lot of it at the end of the day is a political question about how this is going to be resolved. But I mean, I think, where there is responsibility at the Scottish level for developing a climate change plan, for delivering in a climate change plan, it would seem that the fiscal system has to operate in such a way that there is, and as we've talked, a lot of this is the capital upfront spending, so that funds can be committed in a way that can make investors more confident, and a large part of that is going to be going beyond that 1 year. So I think, whatever happens, there has to be attention to that, about how we can get multi-year funding. Kind of again, what needs to be in this climate change plan. There's a limit to what can go into it under the current system, where you can't commit more than 1 year's funding. But I think at the end of the day, that there is a huge cooperation and coordination thing. I think as far as the role of the Treasury goes, I mean, we do interact with the Treasury in terms of our research, in terms of understanding what are the economy-wide impacts, the costs and the benefits. It's a complex picture for them to get on top of, but absolutely, there's a role for the Treasury here in terms of the allocation of resources. But these are government departments at the end of the day. I mean, it's ultimately down to the coordination between UK and Scottish, and of course the role in the Climate Change Committee was talked about earlier. But they do have a specific responsibility to the devolved governments as well as to the national government. So I think there is probably, and there's people, academics who are better qualified than me to talk on the whole kind of governance and how our institutions work. But it would seem to me there is a huge governance challenge in terms of the cooperation and coordination. But I think if we're talking about a practical step, something that does need to be looked at is the fiscal settlement, in terms of what the Scottish Government can commit to build up investor confidence.
Thank you. So definitely a gap there in terms of coordination. Mr. Woolley, please.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I mean, totally agree with what Karen says. I mean, again, just to reiterate that I look at the UK as a whole, but I mean, as has been said, a climate change plan isn't a plan without funding to back up the commitments. And it's the same nationwide. We are lacking industrial decarbonisation funding, and I mean, we need it rapidly, and we need it to be insured for 3 to 5 years minimum, because the investment timescales for fuel switching projects are, you're looking at probably 5 years, if not further into the future. So you need it to be guaranteed for fairly long, lengthy time periods. With application windows that are extended rather than short, and focused on high TRL technologies to deploy, rather than we have the technologies, and a lot of money is going on lower TRL to get them up, which is great. But if we're really focused on driving emissions down now, and the sooner you cut out emissions, that has benefits, the better. So it's how can we give businesses certainty to invest in technologies that we already have, and part of that is grants and competitive grant ratios compared with other industrial nations. But again, and I'm sorry to keep harping on about this, it's the ongoing operational cost, because there's never going to be a business case to deploy an industrial heat pump in the UK unless the electricity price allows a business to do so profitably. And we get that right, these things follow. So electricity price means so much in this conversation.
Thank you. I wonder if I could be kept unmuted during my questioning, please, so that I can intervene. I wonder if I can ask some quick-fire questions around about certain aspects of the plan. Obviously, the plan has some emphasis on hydrogen, and the Scottish Government has its own hydrogen strategy. The UK Carbon Committee is not so keen on hydrogen. What are folks' views on hydrogen production and Scotland's part in that, and how that can help us reach net zero? And maybe go to Professor Delou first, please.
Oh, again, a lot in that question. So does hydrogen have a role in the energy system? Yes, but I think at the moment the applications are probably slightly more niche than for general application. Hydrogen is a transition fuel. You need to make hydrogen to get there, so you use energy to do so. So I do think it needs both a supply and demand to be created, which is going to be quite complicated. So I do think there's a role for hydrogen, but I think it's probably far bespoke, and it will probably happen in time. What I do think there's a market for is using our underutilized wind capacity, which is actually currently curtailed, and we make curtailment payments to actually use that electricity to turn it into something more useful, either battery storage, or other storage, or hydro storage, or using it for hydrogen creation. So I do think there's some niche opportunity, and so I would expect, there's an element to go in there. Do I see it at large scale this decade? No.
I wonder, Professor Delou, you've talked previously about localised grids. Do you think that localised grids could help create clusters which could help us in terms of emissions reductions?
Yeah, just a little bit for the benefit for all the other committee members. So there was a big conversation around regional pricing over the last couple of years. And of course, there's a decision being made. But there's an element around where you can actually have private grids, local grids. So if you look for data centers, for AI purposes, or you use it for, it's already existing in some of the existing oil and gas terminals or chemical plants where people have private networks. So I do think there's and it could be island solutions, it could be kind of cluster solutions where we have private networks across Scotland. My understanding is fully within the power of the Scottish Government from a consenting, licensing and doability conversation, where we have actually using the capacity we have in Scotland, not having to worry about the export element because we use it locally. But the only element there is it cannot connect to the national grid and the national system. But I do think there's a benefit for community systems, private systems, industrial systems, where we actually can use some of the existing power without having to export it.
Thank you. I wonder if hydrogen has been thought about a little bit more by food and drink manufacturers. I recognise that there are already some projects underway, but I wonder if the Food and Drink Federation and the Federation of Small Business have any views on hydrogen, please.
Certainly from an FDF perspective, I think we are clear that the most likely change is one to electricity rather than hydrogen in general for food processing. Grid connection is important. So if there's no grid connection where you are, there might be other reasons or not the right level of grid connection. But I think we foresee that it being a change to electricity, certainly in the shorter term, maybe in the longer term hydrogen, but it's not, again, it's likely to be more useful for specific projects or in niche projects rather than in general across the industry.
I wonder if anyone else wants to come in on hydrogen, convener. I can't really see. Mr. Woolley, if you just put his hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry. I mean, hydrogen is a fundamental molecule for our sector, so we see it as a raw material, as well as the potential for high heat application, as described earlier. You know, you could use it in a cracker today with the right, changing the burners, etc. So it does have direct application in the chemical sector, and indeed that's captured in the CCC's analysis. The chemical sector is one of the remaining sectors that retains hydrogen as a big part of its emission abatement pathway. So yeah, we can use green hydrogen molecules derived from electricity and water in place of hydrogen that would otherwise be sourced by taking natural gas and knocking off the carbon element, and taking the hydrogen out that way. So it's fundamental to us, and that is recognised by the Climate Change Committee, but it does have discrete uses, high heat processes and feedstock. Comment on kind of versus electrification. So the way that the business models have been pursued so far is that, actually for a site in the middle of nowhere, they're basically being encouraged to decarbonise their heat demand by installing an electrolyser on their site, taking electricity off the grid and turning that into hydrogen and then burning the hydrogen, and they're losing energy throughout that process. So it makes much more sense for most low temperature processes at dispersed sites, just to connect directly to the electricity system, and to be for policy to direct them to do that rather than put in an electrolyser at a net loss to UK Energy.
Thank you. And I think Professor Turner wants to come in as well. Convener, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in hydrogen, and there are probably people you could better speak to about this. But I think, one thing just to note is I think that, we've been alerted as economists that hydrogen is kind of a broad term, and, you can use hydrogen in the production of other things, so that like e-methanol and things like that, I believe. And I think, the work that we're doing up in Shetland, what the plans are at the Sullom Voe terminal, they're talking about local distribution of hydrogen derivatives, things like decarbonising the fishing fleet up there. So I think, you need to call in people who are experts on the process. But I think just this broad term of green hydrogen, as Richard has said, it's kind of like a carrier, isn't it? And there can be derivative fuels produced from that. So it almost comes to me when I try to analyse it as an economist that it's part of a process. And I think, so you see this hydrogen or not hydrogen argument. There are arguments around that in terms of the gas grid and repurposing it and things like that. But I think in industrial uses, it is really about the different things that you can produce. And maybe we've ended up using the term of low carbon fuels, that this might be part of the process. So I think, I would advise that you maybe get some evidence on that, because it can get very yay or nay about the green hydrogen, but it's actually how it's used in the process to get to other low carbon fuels and what that could then decarbonise. And, we've got food and drink here, we've obviously got chemicals, but I mean, a huge area that we need to decarbonise is things like transportation and the fishing fleet, which is important in some areas in Scotland, like Shetland, like the North East.
Thank you very much. We could probably have an entire session on hydrogen. We've missed out things like sustainable aviation fuel and various other things today as well. But I'd like to thank the witnesses for a very, very good session today. And I'll hand back to you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And just in conclusion, there's just a few final questions I'd like to ask. A couple of technical points, perhaps directed to you, Professor DeLu. You've a number of different points made the point that we need to understand the underlying assumptions. I think that was principally about the costs, but also I wonder if that might also relate to the emission pathways. Now that's based on advice from the Committee on Climate Change, which suggested you need balanced pathways, and those broke them down by sector. The CCP takes a similar approach, but it's not entirely clear as to what the differences are between the pathway set out between the Committee of Climate Change and the CCP. Is that another area where we need to understand what the underlying assumptions that have been made by the Scottish Government as to where the differentials might be? Is that a fair point to highlight?
Convener, I think you described it well. I would ask these questions, and I would also overlay that with economic reality. There's a huge amount of demand on government time to do things. Yeah? And so therefore I would also say, is it realistic to do it? Are the pathways realistic for the current Scottish context? You know, because again, the world keeps on changing. So yes, there are different scenarios, different outcomes. Now remember, it's a difference between destination net zero by 2045 and the journey. This is a journey conversation, not a destination conversation. We have choices when we do things, and that I think is really important in the scenarios and the pathways.
Likewise, there's a certain amount of carbon reduction which is baked into the baseline, i.e. it assumes that if there are no policy changes, there will be a certain amount of carbon emissions which are reduced just as a matter of the current status and extent activities. But it's not specific about what those are. Again, is that another area where we need to see clarity on what those assumptions are in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, my colleagues already said it. I think it's really clear around is what is going to happen anyhow without government policy. Yeah? Oil and gas will decline. Things like Mossmorn, Grangemount cluster will change shape. Then there is discretionary choices where you can actually, by good policy and good intervention, do something about it. I think we need to be really clear what is being built in. And again, back into context, right? UK, just over 1% of the global emissions. Scotland, somewhere between 0.08 and 0.1% of emissions. So what is already baked in will get us quite a bit down, but it's about the incremental cost to the last bit. It's the last mile question again, you know, when you think about some of the issues in other industries. So I think we need to be really clear what's happening, but we just need to give it a positive nudge. What does it happen, what needs an intervention, and what needs transformational thinking.
I don't know if any of the other witnesses want to make comment about just clarity on any of the assumptions or things that are implied but need to be made explicit within the plan. I don't see any indications. Can I just ask one final catch-all question? I think we have all been sitting asking questions with the view that climate change is an imperative and reducing our emissions is therefore something that must be done. If for no other reason that it is the world in which our economy will have to compete is one where other countries are already reducing their emissions into a carbon neutral world. But there are those out there that will argue that we are just as simply adding cost to our economy and that it is an error to be pursuing climate targets. Are we all of the view that we must seek to reduce our emissions and seek to achieve a carbon neutral economy? And I just want to just be clear that we are agreed that is an imperative for the Scottish economy.
I mean, we deal with it in a commercial sense. As I said earlier, there is absolutely direct pressure from supermarkets and wholesalers who are essentially working on behalf of their customers to make sure that net zero is built into the food and drink supply chain all the way through. So from that very, very commercial perspective, then yes, absolutely, it's a driver. but also in terms of the economic pressures that we feel as a result of global events. Chocolate prices are 3 times as high as they should be due to 3 failed harvests. There's a whole range of different things, and all this has a direct effect on our ability to produce foods and import ingredients from around the world. All of those, let alone the ethical reasons which we would have, are fundamental signals that the food and drink sector is taking net zero seriously and has to take it seriously as we go forward. So yes, we're fully agreed that we need to drive that. I think I would go back though to what I said, which is it's important that the climate change plan, the actions by industry and the actions by government are clearly working together in a way that continues to support businesses to make that change and to make it quickly to meet those commercial pressures. Because if we don't do that, there's a chance that we will lose market share and lose market opportunity, and that's the real thing that we would want to see in any climate change plan is how businesses are going to be supported on the drive to net zero.
Anyone else like to comment about the?
Yeah, maybe a few closing comments for me on this one. I mean, there's a fundamental role of government in my mind, and I won't describe it as well as you because you kind of, again, live this every day, but it's something about improving the welfare and well-being of its citizens. So whatever we put in place on an emissions reduction plan, whatever we're going to call it, it can't jeopardize the fundamentals of what it's all about, because we can actually get to net zero and basically have no economy, no jobs. So it is about finding that right balance between what is the right outcome, doing it in the right way, and actually making it work for the people. And you have to carry society with us. People saying don't like it, don't see it because the cumulative impact is too high, can't cope with it, business that can't afford it. It's not the right plan. So I would really say is stay is the fundamental principle. If it doesn't improve the welfare and well-being of our citizens in the UK and in Scotland, we have an issue here. So it needs a plan that resonates with people. They feel they can believe in it, they can contribute to it, and they can be part of a just, fair and coordinated transition.
But we do need a plan.
But we do need a plan. It needs to be credible and it needs to be bought in.
That's very helpful. Professor Townend, were you wanting to?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Paul said, and kind of more generally. I mean, I think because this is very much about the journey. I think we've seen it kind of politically. Public support is generally behind the journey to net zero, but it's all about the how. It's what's going to be the effect on them. So, and people aren't. They're affected in a range of ways. What's happening with the cost of living, what's happening with taxation. But people have views on that, in terms of, the decision in the budget recently to take some of the costs out of electricity bills, some of the green costs out of electricity bills, and put them in taxation. I think you maybe see there's broad support. That's a more progressive way of doing things. But I think, crucially, it is about jobs. That's what people are very concerned about. And that's, I think we see that coming in when you go down to a very local level. I mentioned we're working in Shetland, where broadly it's been an oil and gas economy, but broadly people seem to be in favour of net zero, but they want to know what it's going to mean for them. So it's the point that Paul just made. It's about we need to find a way to do this where we're not damaging the welfare of the citizens, and hopefully this is the future of the global economy. I mean, I think that would be the argument for Scotland acting. We're a very small share of global emissions. We're not going to solve climate change. But through doing our bit and being seen as leaders and doing our bit, but also if we can find ways to have successful transitions, that way, that's a global leadership role as well. But if we can find a way to getting a successful transition, we can do it where we take society with us. But it's a real challenge because we've had some unsuccessful transitions already. We've had them historically with steel and coal. And then last year we've got Mosmorran shutting down and things like that. We're already getting industrial activity shutting down, directly linked to some of the carbon pricing and things like that. And I think if that starts to get out into the public view that people's lives are going to be damaged by net zero, that's when you start to get that kind of political shift at the arguments about whether or not we should be doing this. So ideally, we need to maintain the welfare of people, but we should be looking to improve it if we can kind of move early in this net zero world so that we're looking at better jobs coming to Scotland, better outcomes. That's the way that you really will take people along with us.
Finally, Richard, would you like to make any sort of points of view known?
Yeah, I mean, just from our industry, I mean, the people working in the chemicals industry are scientists and engineers, and they understand the science of climate change you know, very well, and they have children and they live and work in local communities, and they want to tackle climate change. And the number of sites that closed last year, and I had interacted, you know, directly with people there who have spent years tearing their hair out, trying to figure out a way that they could get their, you know, business to invest in a decarbonisation solution, but could not find a way for it through because the fundamentals aren't there to do it right now. And with the net result that they close, and those people were looking for jobs in areas that are in manufacturing decline, and it's frustrating and it's depressing, quite frankly. These people want to do the right thing, but they find they can't. And the UK economy is feeling it too. So we need to get this right. It's about how we do it, not what we're doing. And there are answers there. It's, you know, the timing, the sequencing of these things, making the technologies to do things cleanly available at a price at which businesses are willing to invest, making the UK a place with competitively priced clean infrastructure. And then that foreign cash will come flowing in, and hopefully we'll have the jobs and the manufacturing capability to show for it.
Thank you very much. And can I thank all our witnesses for their contributions, which have been over quite a sustained period this morning, and I really thank them for it. It's incredibly useful. This is obviously, in terms of scope, a very expansive document that does encompass a huge number of different things. And I think that the length of our session this morning reflected that. But it's been hugely useful, very interesting, and you have all given the committee a lot to go away and think about. And with that, we move into private session. Thank you very much.